7 years ago, I made a video that would change my life forever, and that was The Witcher 3 Ultimate Critique. At the time I worked on that video, I was a 19-year-old kid who was just throwing together a video in my mom's basement. I really didn't think it would go anywhere. I didn't think anybody would see it. It was just sort of an exercise for me to put out a video expressing my love for a game that got me really into RPGs and narrative-focused games. And all these years later, many videos and subscribers later, I have been asked by the community, by you guys, to revisit the game and share my modern thoughts. After all, the industry has changed a lot since I made that video back in 2017 and since the original launch of The Witcher 3 in 2015. Yeah, that's right, The Witcher 3 came out almost a decade ago. Do you feel like super old yet? I do. It's crazy, but it's that old. And in the same vein as the industry changing, The Witcher 3 also influenced countless games that came after it. I remember listening to an interview with Ashraf Ismail, the game director for Assassin's Creed Origins and Valhalla, who said that they were taking lots of inspiration from The Witcher 3 with this new reboot of the AC franchise. That they wanted, for example, every side quest to have a story. Every NPC interaction should be tied to some person's emotions and feelings about their friends or family or the world in general. And it's not just the Assassin's Creed franchise that has been so directly influenced by the potency of the Witcher franchise. No matter what you think of the game, whether you love it or hate it, The Witcher 3 is without a doubt one of the most influential games to release in the entire PS4 Xbox One generation. Countless games that have come after it have been designed with it in mind, and I think it reset expectations for what these types of open world adventure games could offer players. I've said many times, but I think games like Fallout 4, for example, which also released in 2015, were particularly burdened by the shadow of The Witcher 3. After people were like, hey, this doesn't seem that deep or complex or interesting, people had The Witcher 3 to point back to and say, see, that's what we want. In the same way that I think games like Baldur's Gate 3 are going to cause RPG players to look back in the next few years saying, no, we want it like that. We want what they did. These types of hugely influential games come once every 7 to 10 years, and The Witcher 3, without a doubt, is one of them. But even so, The Witcher 3 is far from a perfect game. There are lots of things that they could do to improve it for the newly announced Witcher 4, and considering we got Cyberpunk 2077 in between The Witcher 3 and today, there are obvious lessons that have been learned from The Witcher 3. There were some things which perhaps negatively impacted the development of Cyberpunk 2077 in the shadow of The Witcher 3, but then those lessons were relearned for the Phantom Liberty DLC, and I think there's a lot of cool information and cool little tidbits that we can look at as we go through this video to learn what The Witcher 4 is probably going to look like, and for us to voice our desires and hopes for what that game brings to the table. And that brings me to the central point of this video, which is not to recap the entire story of The Witcher 3 and its expansions. It's not to go through obsessive compulsively through every single gameplay mechanic and calculate what percentage damage buff will get you here and there. That's not really what we're doing here. Other channels have done that far better. What I want to do is go back and look at The Witcher 3, appreciate it for all of the good things that it did, but also look at it with a modern lens at what it could do better on modern hardware for modern audiences. And with all of that, I hope to be able at the end of this video to go through and comprehensively offer my thoughts for what The Witcher 4 should bring to the table in terms of gameplay, narrative, broader design, all of that. And before anybody says it in the comments, yes, this was basically just an excuse for me to go back and play through The Witcher 3 and all of the DLC and call it work. Yeah, that's basically what we're doing here. I got to go back and replay it, and I'm excited to talk about it here and now. This video is going to be pretty sizable, so make sure to buckle up, subscribe, like the video, blah, 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 but also have timestamps and everything for you to jump around the video if you see fit. But with that said, let's get into it. This may come as a surprise, but CD Projekt Red was not always considered a world-class studio. For a long time, they were actually primarily seen as a distributor, kind of like Steam or G2A or something like that. They distributed games throughout Poland and throughout Europe. And after a little while, they said, you know what, we can make games too. And so they decided to start developing The Witcher 1, which we've looked at in other I Tried videos, for example, you can see on screen here. And you know what? It's definitely a first attempt game. It's very clunky, but most studios' first attempt at video game production is wrought with some problems as they try to figure out what the hell they're actually doing. The Witcher 2 would come out just a handful of years later and was praised and lauded for really high quality storytelling. And while it still wasn't quite a masterpiece, they were getting their feet under them and they were starting to make serious progress. And then development on The Witcher 3 started. They worked on it for a handful of years, but when we finally saw a gameplay reveal trailer in 2013, this is what it looked like. Now, if you've played The Witcher 3, you know that it doesn't really look that much like this. I mean, it's in some ways, it was like downgraded and then parts of it were cut out, and then they go to this cinematic trailer after that. But then in other ways, it was greatly enhanced and improved. So I think it's just fascinating to look back at these trailers and see where they started versus where they ended up, because I feel like this trailer looks much more like The Witcher 2 than it does The Witcher 3 as we would eventually come to know it. But you can definitely tell they made a lot of progress. They did a lot of work in the years between this 2013 to 2015 when the game would eventually launch. As you can see, they advertise a multi-region open world. That's something we'll talk about later because this was not a total open world. This was something that was a little bit more segmented. They show all sorts of new things like sailing the boat. They show sirens. They show taverns full of NPCs, new combat systems, monsters, and all sorts of crazy, crazy stuff. But even with this game still didn't quite break into the mainstream. It was still considered pretty niche. As we got closer to 2015, specifically May, when The Witcher 3 would launch, information started going around. People started seeing previews of The Witcher 3, and some people started to sit up and go, hey, this might actually be like something significant. This might be pretty impressive. And before long, reviews started going up all over the place. Places like IGN giving it a 9.3, praising it for the open world role playing, responsive combat, only criticizing it for story padding and things like that. And other outlets like GameSpot and Eurogamer all started praising it. And before long, it was being discussed as one of the clear frontrunners for Game of the Year, which was pretty crazy because 2015 was no slacker when it came to big releases. Just in 2015, we had Bloodborne, Fallout 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and even Super Mario Maker launched that year. And I guess an honorable mention goes to Rocket League because that game is still around and is now sort of part of Fortnite. I don't really know what happened there, but either way, lots of huge games that we still talk about today launched back in 2015, and The Witcher 3 would eventually go on to beat them all out. They won Best Developer, they won Game of the Year, which again, if you go back to 2014 and you asked people what was going to win Game of the Year, people overwhelmingly would have said the next Fallout game. Of course that's going to win Game of the Year. There's no way this little known Polish development studio, CD Projekt Red, is going to beat them out. It's Bethesda, for God's sake. They just made Skyrim. But sure enough, it really was that good. And it made a lot of people sit up and go, how did they manage this? Like, this is their third game and it's Game of the Year, beating out some of the biggest players in the industry. How did we get here? And thankfully, there were a handful of documentaries done by NoClip, for example, which makes tremendous documentaries on video game topics and developers and things. And they went and interviewed a bunch of the game developers. They went to the studio, interviewed producers and designers, and we got a lot of really interesting tidbits on how these games are put together. One of my favorites of these is actually a small documentary that they did in pieces for The Witcher 3 as part of NoClip's project on The Witcher 3 as a release. And it was this 26-minute or so clip where they go through and interview a bunch of the game's quest designers, level designers, and interviewed them about how they actually put this together and what they learned from The Witcher 2 and how that affected The Witcher 3 and what their process was, because this was at a pretty formative time. I mean, again, they were figuring out how to design an open world in real time. The Witcher 2 was not really open world, it was hub-based, and so The Witcher 3 going open world and also having multiple open world maps was a pretty significant shift and change, and they had to figure it out. And they did it by testing a lot of things with play tests. They did it by analyzing a bunch of player data and trying to figure out what players were doing and when, how much time was going on between those points of interest and things. And that leads us to something I've talked about for years and years and years, which is the 30-second or sometimes called the 40-second rule of open world games. The best way to illustrate this is with this interactive map of Skellige, which I've pulled up on streams and stuff before. You can see that it has all of the points of interest marked, and that's for a reason, because I want to show you something. When they were developing The Witcher 3, what they realized was that players have certain tendencies, which is that they will travel along roads, they'll travel along pathways with long lines of sight so they can see where they're going or try to notice interesting things to go towards. But most importantly, players will sort of mentally disconnect if too much time is between things that garner interest, and they will also get overwhelmed and mentally check out if the amount of time between points of interest is too small. This is the age-old problem with Assassin's Creed games, for example, where there's just thousands of little points of interest scattered all over the map, and you very quickly end up with what people call a collectathon game, where there's just countless things or trinkets or treasures to be found and just checklists to be completed without much thought or reason put behind them. They're just littered across the map every 5 feet. That leads to a situation when players mentally disconnect and check out. They get overwhelmed by the amount of stuff sprinkled everywhere, and so they just frankly stop paying attention. This for me was the big problem with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which to be fair, I had plenty of problems. I made a 3-hour critique about that game, tearing it apart. I think that this is an issue a lot of devs don't truly appreciate, which is that they get focused so much on quantity that they lose sight of quality, and also the fact that even if the quality level is high, if there's too much, it will still be overwhelming. In the years since The Witcher 3, we've seen other games implement these rules consistently across their open worlds, which is why I've done multiple tests of this open world rule for countless other games, whether it's Fallout New Vegas, which came of course before The Witcher 3, or more modern games like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, or even something like Red Dead Redemption 2. And the consistent thing that we've found with these open world games is that there is not actually a consistent amount of time between points of interest across games. Some games might have 30 seconds on average between points of interest. Others might have 40 or 15 seconds. But what we did find is that when you look at a specific game, there is a consistent amount of time to reach each point of interest as you scatter across the map. For games like Hogwarts Legacy, the time is shorter, between 15 and 25 seconds. For other games, though, that are much slower paced, like a Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, the amount of time between points of interest will be much greater. In that case, it's closer to 80 seconds on average between things that garner interest for the player, whether that's an NPC interaction or some creature or wildlife that calls your attention, or even just a big set piece or point of interest that you see in the distance, like a tall building or a train that's going by blowing its whistle. If it's enough to tickle your brain and make you sit up and pay attention again, that is enough to count here. And in all of these games, there is a consistent philosophy when it comes to how far apart these things should be. And what you find in good open world games is that those rules tend to be much more consistently applied across the entire map. And if there are any places where there are more scarce points of interest, you start to mentally check out, and those areas are much more boring to explore and people don't bother going there. Perhaps intentionally on the part of the developers, they don't want you going there, but still it's very interesting to see how it is employed. And as you can see in this interactive map from Skellige, if you look at the water, the distance between each of these points of interest starts to grow very consistent. In the wide open areas where there's a lot of just water to be found, you can tell that these distances are pretty consistent and very close. These are all intended to be roughly within 30 seconds of each other, and the way that these are placed is such that the player should get distracted and veer off and do things as they travel. So for example, if you were here at this point, the Polygap coast, and you decided I need to sail north, I need to go to the old watchtower, or I need to go all the way up to Svorlag, I need to get up there. You start sailing your boat up here, and then you'll see this point of interest pop up, the Smuggler's Cache, and you might veer off to the right and go there. And then after you deal with that, you swim down, you get the cache, you start sailing back to the harbor where you're going, and you see another thing calling your attention just 30 seconds later, and you veer off and you go there. And then you keep sailing and you see, oh, wait, there's more points of interest. I'm going to go get this hidden treasure. And there's another one over here. I'm going to go over there. And then I'm going to sail into the harbor and I'm going to do that. And so just what could have been a beeline straight to the shore, and then you go to the point of interest you meant to go to, they've managed to like detour you to 1, 2, 3, 4 different points of interest, different things for you to do on the way to do something that you actually meant to do. And that is the key with these open world games, is to get you to get distracted. They want you to lose focus, to drift off, to get distracted doing something else for an hour. And that is something that is sort of magical about The Witcher 3. If you've played through it in a very immersive way, you will be playing the game and you will mean to go do one thing. Hey, I'm going to head up to Oxenford and I'm going to go take care of this quest line for the main story. But then you'll look up an hour and a half later and you're like, oh, I got caught up doing this Witcher contract and then I did this side quest and I don't know what happened, but I'm going back to Oxenford. That's what I need to go do. And then you refocus. You just lose yourself in the game. It's why I've said that The Witcher 3 is very easy to play. Not that it's too like easy in terms of combat scaling or enemy difficulty or hit points or anything. What I mean is that it's easy to just play and get lost in, to lose yourself to the game once you've given yourself over. And that is in large part based on these very simple techniques that they use to distract you as you play through the game. Of course, in the water, it's really easy to tell how these are spaced and how they've done it, and how between these points of interest, these major land masses that you're going to be going to, they'll sprinkle things in to pull your attention away. But once you look at land masses as well, you'll see that it follows a similar vein. This time though, usually with caves or other things like places of power or monster nests and things like that. There's also a lot of side quests that are sprinkled in these mountains, but nonetheless, the rule is consistent across the entire thing. And there's a reason why so many open world games employ this same technique. I've even spoken to designers at, for example, the studio behind Hogwarts Legacy, Avalanche, or even Bethesda Game Studios. I spoke to somebody that used to work there, and they said that after The Witcher 3 came out, everybody kind of sat up and tried to pay attention to why this open world worked, and then they made concerted efforts to implement the same techniques. Again, when we say that The Witcher 3 was very influential, we're not joking. It seriously did cause many developers to sit up, and even the techniques that were utilized here were later implemented into games like Breath of the Wild. There's an entire GDC talk about the open world design there and how they focused even on the shapes of certain land masses or mountains in the background or foreground to steer the player in certain directions in that open world. Or even discussions we've had about games like Elden Ring, which also implemented similar techniques to keep players engaged for long periods of time. This was nothing brand new when it came to The Witcher 3, but The Witcher 3 certainly modernized it for open world games in a way that nobody else had really done. Because prior to this, the standard was the likes of like Dragon Age Inquisition, which notably won Game of the Year in 2014 and was considered one of the best open world games that had ever released at the time, and other things like big Assassin's Creed titles that were known for sprinkling in tons of collectathon garbage throughout the maps. But this was one of the first times that a big recognizable big AAA game focused on quality of those interactions, and then also spacing them far enough apart that the player feels like they actually are on an adventure journeying to those points of interests as they go through their time with the game. Other things that developers spoke to after their experiences with The Witcher 1 and The Witcher 2 were that they wanted to focus on having stories tied to every single quest line. They wanted to focus on having gameplay systems that integrated with other systems within the game. So the combat should tie in with the alchemy system, should tie in with the day-night cycle, meaning that the player needs to meditate with Geralt to make him pass time, which also refills his potions and decoctions and things like that. And one way I heard a designer describe it was that they wanted to create a web of a video game where everything is interconnected, everything ties together, and so you never feel as though you are going off doing something totally unrelated. Even something like Gwent should be implemented in a way where it feels natural within the game. And when you go to a shopkeeper, they might be selling Gwent cards, or maybe, you know, you go and you collect Gwent cards as you play through tournaments, or you play against other NPCs in the world, and then you collect those cards and you sell them off as part of your means of making money. All of that should be interconnected. And there were many, many other things that they did in the creation of The Witcher 3 that helped them get there, that they've also kept to themselves, which makes sense. There's been things like GDC talks or developer talks and interviews and things where they talk about their process. But of course, the secret sauce sauce, the stuff that really makes The Witcher 3 tick, that really helps their game stand apart from all the rest. They don't want to be too open about that, because if they were, then everybody would start to implement their same little tricks, and you know, that wouldn't help them at the end of the day. So specific tidbits about like story pacing, or how they write quest lines or dialogue in a way that's really grounded and witty, but also relatable and interesting. How they do all of that, they haven't been super clear about. It might just be the talent of the individual writers, which I'm sure is a huge part of it. But also there's definitely little tricks and tips that they could share that they've kept to themselves. It's a little bit of a mystery how some of this stuff came to be, but nonetheless, it's really good, so nobody's asking too many questions, just so long as they can keep up this quality. But the point is, The Witcher 3, when we would eventually get it, was a surprise to many, many people, and was extremely good. But why was it so good? Well, let's talk about it. Some of the things that I think everybody agrees on are really good, and then other things that I've come to appreciate all the more looking at this game and playing through it in 2024 after all of this time. Because there's some things I think that were really impressive for the time that nowadays is kind of like, eh. And then there's other things that I appreciate nowadays way, way more than I would have back in, like, say 2016 or 17, which, no spoilers, it's the writing, but we'll get there. There are many things that The Witcher 3 does really, really well, and that's what I'm going to go through here. First, sort of a streamlined list of all the things I think that this game does really, really well. And then I'm going to talk about the things I think that are not super well done, frustrations, shortcomings, glitches, things like that I think are not the best when it comes to this particular game. And then after that, we're going to drift into discussions of the expansions, which specifically answer some of the frustrations and things that I have problems with when it comes to the base game. Can you imagine that? An expansion actually like fixing problems from a base game? How crazy is that? The first thing I think The Witcher 3 does very well, which is going to come as no surprise to anybody, is the immersive open world. From the first moments spent in White Orchard all the way to the exploration of Skellige or Velen or Toussaint, every part of The Witcher 3 is unique and beautiful and very, very well put together in my opinion, with a couple of small exceptions. As I already outlined, the open world design of The Witcher 3 is top-notch, especially for the time. I think it was pretty groundbreaking. That being said, there are still some areas where I think there's just weird energy present in the map where it just feels too hollow or empty. Notably, if you look at places like Velen or Novigrad, there's entire areas of the map which are just totally blank and unused, where you hit invisible walls, even though there's nothing really preventing you from continuing, you just aren't allowed to beyond that point. I understand there has to be some limitation or something there, but it still is a little jarring to be exploring and to be in it, immersed and exploring, riding on Roach or something, and then to just hit an invisible wall. I just don't personally like that. The other piece of it that I don't like is how broken up it is. I understand why they separated, for example, Skellige off onto a different map, or Toussaint for the Blood and Wine expansion into a different map. But when it comes to White Orchard being separated from Novigrad, being separated from Velen, like, that to me is just a little jarring, but it's also a remnant of its time. In 2015, it was much more normal to do that. It wasn't customary to just have the one gigantic country-sized map for you to play on. So a remnant of its time, but that's definitely something I would like to see streamlined for a future release where everything is just in one map without load screens between them. I also greatly appreciate that each major area has its own climate, its own clothing style for NPCs, even for Geralt in given quest lines. If he's tasked with dressing up for a fancy dinner or something like that, his clothing style will reflect the area of the world he is in. The architecture is all different as you move through the game as well, and even NPCs will talk differently depending on where they live or the social class that they're in. Even within big cities in the game, like Novigrad for example, the better neighborhood that an NPC or shopkeeper lives in, the fancier they'll dress or the cockier they'll act. But even so, they will still have things that unite them, such as hatred for monsters, fear of the war going on, and their obsessive fascination with Gwent. Furthermore, the art direction of these cities is top-notch. Even in that debut gameplay trailer from E3 2013, you can see that Novigrad is much flatter. It's much more Witcher 2 in presentation. There's a lot less color, but when you look at it in the final game, it's way more vibrant, way more lively. They got rid of that weird Xbox 360 era green gray filter that went over every game that released during that time and instead added a lot more vividity to the frame. And this is perhaps what I find all the more impressive about the art style, is that they made major changes in the last 2 years of the game's development that totally changed how these cities looked and felt. Initially, it seems like they were going for a much colder, darker tone throughout the game, but when we finally got the finished product, it was much more vibrant in certain areas, much brighter within cities, and it was still dark in some parts of the map, still very gritty and war-torn in certain areas, but they had the contrast, and that's what I really appreciate. You know, contrast is something in games that I think can often be lacking. It's really easy to just make a painfully dark game where everything's just horrible and terrible. Like Hellblade 2, for example, where there's no levity. It's exhausting to play that game because it's just one awful thing after another. Or even something like The Last of Us Part 2, where playing through that game is like a marathon of misery. You have to be in the right headspace, and by the time you finish the game, even if you loved it, you're ready to put it down because it's just so emotionally taxing, because there's no real moments of levity. There's nothing to really lift you up or make you chuckle or laugh or to allow you to let go and relax for just a minute. But The Witcher 3 actually manages to pull that off. There are areas of this world which are horrible and war-torn and disgusting, as we've seen in lots of cinematic trailers for The Witcher 3, for example. But then there's other areas where life is pretty good, where everything's pretty comfortable, where everybody is just walking around having a great time. And Toussaint in the Blood and Wine expansion is a great example of this, where it's just a bunch of hoity-toity rich people that are obsessed with wine, that are totally out of touch with the common concerns of people just a little ways away from them in like Novigrad or Velen, who are totally out of touch with all of the horrors going on in the war-torn areas around them. But it's those moments of levity and light that make the moments of dark and grit all the more potent, because you realize just how different it is. And I greatly appreciate that you can have moments that are a little lighter, and those make you appreciate and take more seriously the moments of darkness and evil that do come up in the story and in side quests and things like that. And I want to be very clear that I hope they retain that variability, that contrast, because in that announcement trailer we got for The Witcher 4, as I'm sure all of you have seen, it's pretty dark, it's pretty gritty. And the reason I'm not like worried too much is because this was the same with announcement trailers and cinematic trailers for The Witcher 3. A lot of them were very dark, very gritty, and very like tough to watch, frankly. But then the final game struck a good balance. And even in games like Cyberpunk 2077 and of course the Phantom Liberty expansion that came after it, they managed to strike that variability in tone. And so I'm confident that they understand that this is something they need to do. So I don't think it's anything to be really worried about, but I just want to reaffirm, I like having a little bit of variance in the tone, in the colors, the brightness, the vibes. Paired with the open world is of course the day-night cycle and the weather systems that are fairly well implemented. I love personally going to Skellige. It feels so different from White Orchard or from Novigrad, for example. It's just like a different planet, almost a different game entirely. The people talk differently, dress differently. The quests are much darker and grittier. I freaking love it. And I love that The Witcher 3 has these different things available to players to explore. And once again, it offers that contrast to keep things interesting. Guard behaviors do change at night, though not that much, and NPC behaviors also will be different at nighttime versus daytime. But beyond that, there's nothing more than maybe a couple of little generic lines that pop when it's raining or at nighttime for NPCs that see you lurking in the shadows. We'll talk more about the NPC AI and stuff here in just a little bit, but I definitely think that's one of the weak points that the rest of the game kind of makes all the more obvious, because you get so immersed in it that when you see really dumb NPCs just walking in circles, it can be a little jarring. But again, we'll get to it. Perhaps the greatest strength of The Witcher 3, though, is its narrative and the storytelling in general. They, of course, have many mature themes that are borrowed from the books from Andrzej Sapkowski, and they focus, at least in general, on blurred lines between moral choices. The idea that there's never really a good option, there's just the best option. And this, of course, follows in line with a famous quote from the Witcher books, which has been echoed not just in the Netflix show, but across the board, because it is the theme in many ways of Geralt as a character. And that's when Geralt says, evil is evil, lesser, greater, middling, makes no difference. The degree is arbitrary, the definition's blurred. If I'm to choose between one evil and another, I'd rather not choose at all. Which is a beautiful, beautiful line. It is a little funny that even still Geralt has to make choices because it's an RPG video game, and so you're gonna still be prompted with requests and requirements to choose which way the story is going to go. But I at least get what Geralt is trying to communicate there. And this is a theme across the entirety of the Witcher books, the show, at least for like a couple episodes, and the games, of course, which is that there's often situations which are just terrible and bad, and there's not a clear or good answer to anything. You just kind of have to make the most of it if you can, but sometimes no choice or not getting involved between two bad choices is the better choice. And it's a theme that's explored a lot, not just in the base game and the books and everything, but also in the expansions as well. There is the questline La Cage à Feu. I have no idea if that was pronounced correctly. I'm sorry. But in that quest line where you go and have the confrontation with the White, there is actually a broader theme to this quest, which apparently has to do with an old Polish saying, which is, if you are to dine with the devil, you do so with a long spoon. I didn't know that was a saying, but apparently it's like an old Eastern European saying. And that's why she collects all the spoons in her house. That's why the curse is worded the way that it is, because it's alluding to that old saying. But that has to do with the same general philosophy and idea, which is that if evil is present, try to stay as far away from it as you can, because getting up close and personal might give you some short-term benefit, but it's not actually going to pay off in the end. And it was, of course, also explored in the Hearts of Stone expansion with Olgierd von Everick and the deal he made with Gontor Dim, or the Master of Mirror, who's basically this world's version of the devil. And notably, also in the Hearts of Stone expansion, he uses spoons multiple times throughout the storyline, whether it's when you first meet him in the opening of the base game, or if it's later on the ship when Gontor Dim actually snaps the spoon to trigger the effect and spell and curse and everything like that that kicks off from that point forward. I had no idea that like little spoons have sort of an evil connotation in some cultures, but apparently they do. And now you know that as well. So make of that what you will. One of the other things that the main story and even side quests like to explore is the political intrigue between these different cultures and governing bodies within the world of The Witcher 3. You know, nowadays people say they don't like politics in video games, but I think they just don't like poor implementations of political discussions. When it's handled intelligently or in a way that's respectful to the audience, it can be really fascinating to explore the nitty-gritty implications of a Nilfgaardian takeover of these lands when they're just some big imperial force. Maybe it's actually for the better because they also bring with them wealth and prosperity and firm rule. But then again, it's also like, well, nobody really wants them here and nobody's asking for their help. And, you know, you can have interesting conversations and interesting thoughts between NPCs and the player character when you discuss it intelligently, which The Witcher 3 absolutely does. I think it's poor implementations of these topics that people get driven crazy by. But beyond political intrigue, there's also plenty of choices which have significant consequence that Geralt can make as you go through the game. Don't get it twisted, The Witcher 3 is not an RPG sandbox, but it still has significant choices to be made, and those choices have impact on the world around you and the characters that inhabit it. This is something I hear people throw at The Witcher 3 when they're trying to like tear it down, which is that, well, it's not a true RPG. Like, you can't do anything you want. There's no like serial killer run available, and there's no pacifist run or whatever. And I think that that's just a failure of definitions more than anything, because role-playing games at this point, the term RPG has lost all meaning. People call like Assassin's Creed Valhalla an RPG while also calling Sekiro an RPG, and then turning around and calling like Path of Exile 2 an RPG, even though it's an ARPG. You still get what I mean? The term is just so broad that usually it just means that there's a skill tree where you can kind of specialize in stuff. That's almost all it means in 2024 nowadays, unfortunately. But when people call The Witcher 3 an RPG, They are not claiming that you can choose anything, that it is a role-playing sandbox where you can go through, play a pacifist run, go serial killer run, whatever. What they're saying is that you get to choose which role you are playing, and then there's these other gameplay affecting systems as well where choices can be made. Yes, you are playing as Geralt as you go through the game, no matter what. Everybody will have that same experience, but you do get to choose which type of Geralt you play. Whether you play the hardcore, bitter, and stereotypical Witcher who demands money for every single deed, good or bad. When people are in desperate need of help, he refuses to do so unless they can pay up. Or you can choose to play a nicer, more kind-hearted version of Geralt. And while those choices do have impact within individual side quests, while they affect how much money you make from quests, or even some choices affect whether certain NPCs make it to the end of the game, such as Karametz, who can notably be killed off if you don't want her continuing her, let's just say, research in your absence. And this also follows over to the expansions, where the decisions you make can have significant impact on what type of gear or loot you get, or on whether certain characters survive and make it to later on in the story. In the Hearts of Stone expansion, you of course get the choice of what to do with Olgierd. At the very end of the expansion, you can choose to let Gunter Odim fulfill the contract and kill Olgierd von Everec, taking his soul. If you do that, you get to choose what reward you want. You can either choose to become rich, in which case you get paid out 5,000 crowns. You can ask for a bottle of vodka that's always full, which is basically just a never-ending supply of hard alcohol used for potion crafting and things like that, which is kind of cool. You can choose to never go hungry again, which is just a horn of plenty, giving you an endless food supply. Or you can choose to be swift as the wind, which gives you a special saddle, which emits a sort of black smoke from Roach as you ride around, and also permanently boosts the stamina. You can also ask Gunter if he knows where Ciri is, because you can technically finish the Hearts of Stone expansion before you finish the main story of The Witcher 3. And if you do that, then you could ask him for help on where Ciri is if you haven't found her yet. Interestingly enough, Odim says he can't find her. He doesn't know specifically, but he does give you tips on how to keep her alive for a better ending. So if you choose to go through that way, there even is like a benefit to letting Olgierd die if your primary concern is with Ciri, which I thought was a good touch. Or instead of all of this, you can choose to try and save Olgierd von Everec, and if you do that, then the quest is fulfilled and everything moves on. He gives you his sword in exchange as a reward for the quest line, but it's very quickly made obsolete, especially if you're moving straight into the Blood and Wine expansion. So I think most people are probably just going to take the sword and hang it on the wall at Corvo Bianco once they get to that point in the expansion. That's at least what I did. It's a beautiful sword and I didn't want to sell it for scraps, so I hung it on the wall and now it permanently decorates our living room. It's a weird decoration, I grant you, but it's pretty. I actually have a sword. Do you want to see it? When I was a kid, I said I wanted to get a sword because we went to medieval times, and I always wanted one, and then we went to medieval times like a year ago, and I said, you know what, childhood dream fulfilled right now. So I actually bought a sword and they shipped it to me because obviously you didn't want to take this through TSA, but you know what, it's cool. One of the weirder purchases I've made, I'll grant you, but I mean, I still am glad I did it. I don't know why I needed a sword, but I have it now, so yeah. But to be clear, one of the reasons I love these choices within The Witcher 3 is that they are not your stereotypical good guy, bad guy choice. It's not the good moral choice and a totally evil, disgusting choice. And on the flip side, it's also not like a Dragon Age Veilguard choice where it's a really nice person choice and then like an understandable but still good person choice with no space between, really. Instead, in The Witcher 3, usually the situations Geralt is forced within challenge him to make a choice that is just the best of two rough options. In other words, it just puts you into more of a moral gray area, especially when you consider that saying that we just went through a moment ago, where Geralt says he would personally rather just not make a choice at all if it's between two evils. Some examples would be with the Bloody Baron questline, which is probably one of the best questlines in any RPG I have ever played. I can't think of another questline that is as memorable or as potent emotionally or well written and executed as the Bloody Baron. It really is masterfully done and is the highlight of the first third of The Witcher 3. It really is phenomenal. I cannot praise it enough, and I'm sure you think the same, because to disagree would be to be totally out of your mind, because it's that good. But in the Bloody Baron questline, for example, you have the choice of telling the Baron about his wife, Anna, being cursed by the crones, or you can keep it secret and just kind of encourage him to move on and not focus on her anymore and to just accept that she's gone. If you tell him the truth, it will lead to the Baron trying to save Anna, which could potentially cause further harm to her, because of course he's not exactly the best husband, even though he seems very apologetic for everything he did previously. Though keeping it a secret will pretty much keep her stuck with the crones in perpetuity, which is also not a great option. So either you're sending her to stay with the crones, or you're going to send her abusive husband in after her. Not a great situation to be in. Another example is one I referenced in my original critique of the game, which is actually the questline where you retrieve the swallow potion initially in White Orchard. Basically, there was a young girl who went out into the forest with her beloved in the middle of the night. During that time, they were attacked and she was severely wounded. Geralt, when he goes to the herbalist hut to brew swallow initially, sees the girl laying on the bed in the back of the hut and asks if there's anything that can be done. The herbalist says that she's basically just mitigating pain at this point and there's not much that can be done. She'll be dead within just a day or two. And Geralt offers to brew swallow in order to give it to the girl, but it's really important to note that they're not intended for humans. I mean, they're intended for witchers, and they can be very potent, and if anything, it could lead to an excruciating death if she were to take it and it not work. But at the very least, there would be a chance she could survive if given it. So the player is tasked once again with a sort of rough moral choice of deciding, do I try to help her but potentially make her death excruciating and extra horrible, or do I just kind of help her drift off into the next world? Like, what do I do? I don't know. You know, it's that sort of gray area that so many choices in The Witcher 3 land, and I love it. But you might be wondering what actually does happen if you give this girl, Lena, the swallow potion. And there actually is something written in. They could have just left it ambiguous and, you know, you never really find out and it just ends somehow, you never know. But they actually did write in a little epilogue where they tell you what happened. And I don't actually have footage recorded of this, amazingly enough, on my server with our like 2 terabytes of footage that we've collected just for this video. I can't believe I don't have footage of it, but nonetheless, 2236 Gaming did record this 9 years ago. So I'm just gonna let this play and we can check it out because it's pretty crazy. Basically, Geralt just travels to an encampment and you run across a guy who stops you to talk to you.
Hey, you, halt! Geralt of Rivia, correct? You were in White Orchard recently, near Vizima.
Charming village, if you don't mind rotting corpses.
There'd have been one more if not for you. Lena, she survived, thanks to your potion.
Nice to see an Nilfgaardian soldier so concerned about the fate of some simple Nordling. But kind of surprising, too.
That night, when the Griffin attacked her, she was on her way to meet me. In the woods, near the garrison.
Love knows no bounds.
Not so. Her parents told her that if they saw her with a Nilfgaardian, they would shave her head, cut out her tongue, and banish her from their home.
Jesus.
Listen, Lena, she has not fully recovered. I took her with me when I was transferred. Thought she might get better. But no, she says nothing, recognizes no one, sleeps most of the day.
I warned Tamira. Witcher potions have powerful, usually permanent side effects. Can't do anything to help now. Maybe a mage could.
I don't know whether to thank you or curse you for not letting her die with dignity.
Trust me, Choice I had to make was harder.
Jesus. Like, but you see what I mean? It's like, even though there was a choice and they thought about it and they did all that, there still was not really a clear good thing, a good conclusion to it. You know, it just leaves you like, okay, I feel sad now. You know, and I understand why some people might not like that. I have some friends that, frankly, if there's not a happy ending, they're not interested. My buddy Corey, for example, he hates the idea of La La Land as a movie because it doesn't, spoiler alert, doesn't have a happy ending according to most people who watch it. It has an ending that I would say is very on tone for the idea of La La Land, that people are willing to sell out everything that's important to them so long as they get ahead and gain power and fame and wealth and fortune. But nonetheless, it's not a happy ending. And so he absolutely hates that movie. Whereas I appreciate it even more for that ending. But I can understand why he doesn't like it for that reason. And The Witcher 3 is sort of a similar thing. Some people want the happy ending. Some people want the good feelings. And for those people, there's games like Dragon Age Veilguard, where everything is just super lighthearted and silly and nothing really bad ever happens. That's okay. That's okay. You play those games. But I am very thankful that we have something like this, The Witcher 3, where there's a little bit more depth and not just characters sitting around talking about their fifis and drinking coffee. If you haven't played Dragon Age the Veilguard, that will not have made a lot of sense, but I guarantee you if you did play it, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. In the same vein as the writing, all of the characters are very, very well written. They have multi-dimensional personalities, and they also evolve throughout the story. Whether you look at Yen or Geralt or Triss or Ciri, they all change as the story goes on, also influenced by your decisions. Though I will say Triss in this game is like way more whiny than I think she frankly should be. Like in the books, she is not this just much of a bummer and buzzkill, but I swear every time she comes on screen, it's like, bro, I didn't remember it that way until I replayed it, you know, for this video. But man, Triss is like a major buzzkill 99% of the time. Like in the books, she's generally considered very much like a warm and kind person, somebody that makes you feel comfortable, and she lights up a room when she walks in it and that type of thing. But in The Witcher 3, she shows up and is just like, woe is me, pouting in the corner. I don't know what it is, man. Maybe I'm just old and jaded now, because when I was younger and I played The Witcher 3, I didn't think of her that way, but maybe I was just distracted by her large talents. I don't know. One of the other little tidbits about The Witcher 3 that I appreciate is when it comes to romances, if you try to choose between Triss and Yen, you go through their quest lines and you get closer to them based on your choices for a little while, but eventually you kind of hit a point of no return and you have to choose which one you're going to commit to. And if you choose to commit to Yen and then also try to commit to Triss, they will actually find out and then both come together and effectively shun you. You don't get to be with either of them, and that makes the end of the Blood and Wine expansion all the funnier. Little spoilers real quick for Blood and Wine. At the end of it, like the final little sequence is typically that you are in Corvo Bianco and Geralt is like finally basically retiring and chilling. He's gonna finally just relax and drink wine and calm down. That's kind of how they set it up for somebody else to take the helm of the Witcher franchise after this game, which is why anybody who thought Geralt was going to be the protagonist of The Witcher 4 was just totally out of touch, didn't play the game, had no idea what they were talking about. But they set it up that way, and typically it's your romance partner that shows up with you. So if you romanced Yen, she shows up. If you romance Triss, she shows up for you. But if you tried to romance both of them, nobody shows up. You're alone. Which is pretty funny. Technically speaking, Ciri will visit you still, kind of just like a passing visit if she survived the end of the base game. But if she did not survive the end of the base game, Dandelion just shows up to visit Geralt and is kind of like, sorry, old man, sucks to suck. It's pretty funny. So they thought of everything and I appreciate it. It's pretty funny. If you choose to be just a total a-hole and just try to use both of them at the same time, for, I guess, just being too horny, you actually get punished for it, which is kind of funny. And the other thing I absolutely have to praise about the game is the music and sound design. I cannot tell you how iconic this soundtrack is at this point. You hear 5 seconds, dare I say 1 second of any one of these songs, immediately you recognize it as The Witcher. And it's a vibe. It ties together with the land you're exploring at that time. The music's going to be different whether you're in Skellige or walking through the streets of Novigrad. It's really, really well done. And I think they deserve all the credit that's been given to them at this point and more for the sound design and music. It really is top notch. It's fantastic. There's of course other little tidbits that we could go through, such as the graphics, which were really good for the time. I actually have this like core memory of going over to my friend Olivia's house, and her father had just gotten an Xbox One in 2015, and it was like the first time anybody in my friend group had gotten a brand new gaming console like that, because most of us didn't play video games that actively, or at least not modern like AAA games. And so when her dad got the Xbox One, he hooked it up to the TV, and I was over there hanging out, and I remember, again, core memory, him booting up The Witcher 3, and it's that part where in the opening of the game, the griffin has come down, and like there's the overturned cart and everything. And after you do that, there's the guy with the fishbowl haircut, and you talk to him. And I remember her dad pointing at the screen and saying, "Look, it's so detailed. You can see the pores on his nose." And it was like mind blowing that there would even be like detail like that in a video game. It's like a core memory for me. It's really funny. But like at the time, especially graphically, this game was top notch, and the production quality just in general was really, really good. But there's lots of other little things we could look at. But I think, you know, at this point, it's no surprise for anybody watching this video so far that I think The Witcher 3 is a masterpiece for many, many reasons. That said, though, I don't think it's perfect, and there are problems. There are things that I think needed to be addressed that they eventually did, and they sometimes did it through patches later, or they did it through the expansions that came after the fact in the year or so after the base game launched. And we're going to go through that now. So buckle up. We're going to talk about frustrations and shortcomings of The Witcher 3. Don't get mad at me. Now listen, I'm going to be real with my problems on The Witcher 3. I don't want you to get mad at me. I don't want you to think that like I'm trying to be needlessly negative or anything. I just think it's important, if we say the positive, we also discuss the problems, because there are problems, and there were many problems at launch, certainly for The Witcher 3, which some people have kind of forgotten, because we start to look at games that we hold in high esteem with rose-tinted glasses after a little while, and the blinders kind of go on, and we start to forget some of the negatives. So let's discuss it. Let's go through it. And if you have any other tidbits that I miss, definitely leave those in the comments. The first frustration I have had since the moment I picked up the controller with The Witcher 3 has to do with the movement. I think it is way too floaty. Character movement in video games is really, really tough to discuss, because it's one of those things that you feel like when you're actually controlling the game with the controller or mouse and keyboard. And if it's off, it just feels off. And other than describing it as off, there's nothing more you can really do. But I think, to put it simply, as best I can, in The Witcher 3, I think Geralt controls too weightlessly. He runs and just kind of glides across the ground. I think his sprint speed is too fast. I think Roach's speed is too fast. And in general, I feel like the game just doesn't strike a good balance when it comes to exploration and movement throughout the map. I think they wanted it to feel like Geralt is super powerful, and the mutations have had their effect, and so he moves like a bird, you know, he just glides through the air. And I understand why they're doing that, especially with the descriptions as they are in the books. But when it comes to playing the game, I cannot tell you how often I'm running through a tight corridor and Geralt's just bumping into walls because he's moving too quickly. Or if you want to go from walking to like a light jog, there's not really a good middle ground between walking and full-blown sprint. And so you end up feeling like Geralt is just a pinball in a machine bouncing off stuff to get to his end destination. And I just don't like the way it controls. I personally greatly prefer the way that Rockstar games, for example, control, which are much slower and heavier in their movement. Think of how Arthur Morgan controls in comparison to Geralt. Every step has weight, has intentionality to it, and even on horseback, the horse doesn't move like it's crazy fast. It doesn't just start gliding through the air like it does in The Witcher 3. Instead, you have to be much more intentional with the movement. It takes a while to slow down the horse once it picks up speed. And that is partially because of the limitations of the red engine that was used for The Witcher 3, and then also the limitations of the time, where CD Projekt Red had never really built a game on this scale, and they hadn't factored in how fast the horse should run and how fast Geralt should sprint and run and how that should control within the map and within environments. And so the whole thing is just clunky to me, and I hope that the move to Unreal Engine for The Witcher 4 will lead to some higher quality animations, animation blending, and things like that that could be huge improvements over what we got in The Witcher 3. In the same vein, I feel like Roach in general does not control particularly well. The pathfinding on roads is not great. Even when you set Roach to follow the road to the objective, Roach will still splinter off and go the wrong way, or get stuck into a tree or on a rock or something. It's still pretty unreliable and buggy to this day, and it's my understanding that it was much worse when the game launched. People forget, but as you can see in this video from Burger Pal from 2015, there were plenty of bugs. People were doing entire compilation videos of The Witcher 3 at launch for how buggy it was. And part of the benefit of how The Witcher 3 launched was actually that people sort of let it fly under the radar, because it didn't really explode into popularity until after Fallout 4 came out and people really wanted a deep, meaningful RPG. And so they went back later in 2015 to play The Witcher 3 after they were disappointed by Fallout 4, which is just kind of funny how it worked out. But by that time, when most people jumped into the game, especially after it won Game of the Year, and they're like, ooh, I should probably go play that, most of the bugs had been fixed. So the vast majority of players did not experience this version of The Witcher 3. But it's why I think it's important to stress that for a lot of people, the rough state of Cyberpunk 2077 at launch was not a big surprise. Like, The Witcher 3 did not run great at launch. They definitely put it out well before it was ready. And so it wasn't that shocking when we saw them have problems once again with Cyberpunk. But this thankfully was something that was fixed when the game got some more patches as it went out. Of course, it kind of peaked with the disastrous launch, okay, that's a good one, of Cyberpunk 2077. And as a result, a lot of people, I think, held their feet to the fire, rightly so. And hopefully CD Projekt Red has fully learned that lesson. They seemingly definitely learned the lesson back with the Phantom Liberty expansion that they really nailed, in my opinion, especially in terms of performance at launch. And I think the safest bet is that they do not want to repeat the problems of Cyberpunk once more. So if they have to delay the game an entire year internally to get it to run well at launch, I think they're going to do that, because they cannot afford another disaster. But the bugs are definitely something they need to avoid, and it was a problem back in 2015. It was a problem certainly in 2020. Hopefully it's not a problem in 2027 or whenever The Witcher 4 comes out. Beyond movement, probably the most popular complaint of The Witcher 3 actually has to do with the combat. This may come as a surprise to some, because I know there are lots of people that really, really love the combat of The Witcher 3. But I do understand some of the critiques people have, because I do think it's generally pretty clunky. And while the core mechanics work well, you know, with light and heavy attacks, the dodging, parrying, the eventual upgrades to be able to do more elaborate moves or heavy attacks that can be charged up, it's when all of the things are trying to work together in that spider web we alluded to earlier that things start to get really, really shaky. For one, the controls can often feel fairly clunky, and this mainly has to do with the auto aim for swords, and it has to do with the aiming of the crossbow. Firstly, the auto aim for sword fights is pretty inconsistent. Now, I think the easiest way for me to demonstrate exactly the problem I have is with MS Paint, the greatest tool ever given to man. Basically, if Geralt is in the center of a bunch of enemies, what the game has to do is it has to decide when you press X which enemy to target with that sword attack. It's not just doing it in a general direction and hopefully it connects with somebody. Typically in The Witcher 3, it will pick an enemy and that's where it steers towards, kind of like how in the Batman Arkham games, if you point the left stick in a certain direction and then you try to continue your combo, Batman will actually zip over to that enemy and continue the combo even if they are 5-10 feet away. With The Witcher 3, what it does is it basically has a little cone that goes out from Geralt that then is used to select which enemy the attack is going to target. That cone is controlled by the left stick. It's invisible, you don't typically see it, but it's based on the movement input for Geralt. So if you have the left stick pulled down, in this case, it will apply the attack to the enemy at the bottom, so that's where it aims at. And Geralt should, in theory, go in the direction you were trying to push him to with the left stick, so everything works just fine. It also would work just fine if you were aiming for this guy out away from Geralt. You push the left stick up and to the right. The cone will then go off this way. It will select this enemy as the target, and then you will see the attack dealt in that direction. The only exception to this is with like the eventual upgrade to the light attack, where you hold down X or square on PlayStation, and Geralt does the elaborate spinning move where he swings the sword all over the place. That's still influenced by the left stick because it also is rotating this cone and will direct which way Geralt is pointing that attack, but still it will do damage even to those around him who are not directly inside that cone of influence. How this goes badly though, and when it can feel clunky, is when this cone overlaps with multiple enemies. There will be times where you have two enemies standing very, very closely to each other, and this cone will overlap both of them. And so then the game has to decide which enemy you are intending to aim at with that light attack or with that heavy attack. And often it chooses correctly, but sometimes it chooses incorrectly. Maybe this guy is charging up an attack, a heavy attack, to come in and swing at you, but the game thinks you're actually targeting this guy. And so you start dealing attacks to this one, even though he is attacking you. And so you get interrupted and you take a hit, even though you meant to interrupt his attack first. But you know what? This is just a really elaborate way of describing that the game sometimes gets wrong which enemy you're trying to attack. And as a result, you end up taking damage or getting your really cool move interrupted, or sometimes even dying if you were close to that point. And it's not because you necessarily did anything wrong, it's because the game misunderstood. Now, there are some ways you can kind of trick the game into handling this, where you can start the cone over on the far right by pushing the left stick to the right and then scooping it down. And then you end up with the left stick in the bottom right position it was before, where the cone now overlaps with both of these characters. But because you swooped in that way, it effectively latches on to the right one, and then the left guy is left alone. So there are ways that you can still manage the controls as you get comfortable with the game, but it's just inconsistent enough to be annoying even later in the game, especially in Blood and Wine when they start to throw a dozen enemies at you all at once. It can get really, really frustrating. Or in Blood and Wine, especially with the little like serpentine plant-based enemies, they are so infuriating because they have little base pods on the ground and they have the larger target that you have to attack to kill. But this sword aiming system also factors in these little base pods when it's trying to determine what you're trying to attack. So there will be many times when you're trying to attack the big bad monster serpentine thing, but instead you end up attacking this little bulb that explodes. It's really frustrating and stupid. Now you might be wondering, what is the solution to this? Frankly, I think the solution is one that Dark Souls has had for a very long time, and that is to just go to a fully unassisted hitbox-based movement and combat system where you are not trying to help the player with auto-aiming. You just let them judge distance and manage that themselves. The problem with that is that you cannot have clunky movement if you are going with a raw hitbox-based combat system. Just imagine trying to play Elden Ring with a character that moves way too fast for you to finally be able to control that distance between the boss and where you are, and maybe some environmental hazard like a cliffside right next to you. If your character is not super controllable to a very fine degree, it's going to be infuriating. So I think this was the best solution for the foundation that they had, but with the next game, I think they should go to a fully hitbox-based system and give up on the attempted assists. Again, a lot of this happens under the hood of the game, and many people probably won't notice or care. But if you are playing the game through on any of the higher difficulties, this absolutely will be a frustration that bugs you many, 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 many times. And this is one area of the game where I'm not sure if it's a critique or a compliment, but I am a firm believer that The Witcher 3 is a game you need to play through on the Death March difficulty, on the hardest difficulty available. And that's where I think the critique part comes in, because there are many systems in this game that players just frankly don't need to interact with in order to finish the game. You can get through the entire base game with no upgrades to your potions, with no decoctions or messing with any of that. You don't need to brew a single oil or anything like that. You can just go through with chugging water and eating little turkey legs and stuff, because the game is so forgiving on lower difficulties. I'm a firm believer that you should go through The Witcher 3 on the hardest possible difficulty, because the game balances in a way where then, just to make it, you need to be engaging with all of the gameplay systems. You need to be making all of those oils. You need to be brewing decoctions. You have to put a lot of careful consideration into your build. And I think that's where The Witcher 3 is at its best. I understand that makes me sort of a purist, but I really do believe if you are going to go through this game again in 2025, you really, really should try and push yourself and play it on the hardest difficulty possible. I think you will thank me. Initially, you might be bashing your head against the wall because you're not used to it, but I guarantee you, as the game goes on, once you get your feet under you with those potions that are upgraded with higher level gear that you very carefully seek out, you will be having a much better time than if you went through it on the easier difficulties. As for aiming with the crossbow, this has always been extremely clunky. I understand that this is not a primary mechanic for most people. They are aware they have a crossbow, and sometimes it's used for quests, other times it's used for side quests and things. But in general, I think most players are going through the game maybe using bombs more than the crossbow, but it's not their primary mode of interaction with enemies or anything like that. So it's understandable that it had a less important role when it came to the polish and refinement phase of development. But using the crossbow is such a headache unless you get some very specific upgrades that make it easier to use. And even then, the payoff is not particularly great. The one time where I thought the crossbow usage was really, really cool is in the opening sequence of Hearts of Stone, which you can see here. There's a gigantic cyclops that's storming through this area and is wearing a bucket for a helmet. But if you notice, there's a small little sliver, a crack in the helmet. And if you use your crossbow, you can actually shoot through that crack in the bucket. And it is a weak point because it's, of course, his eye. And if you hit that shot, it actually is an instant kill and you can effectively skip the entire boss fight. It's a really cool touch. I loved this, but it's the only time I can think of in the entire game, expansions and all, where the crossbow is really, really useful if you think to use it. All of the other boss fights, while there are some weak points, there's nothing to this extent that really encourages you to specialize or carefully focus on your crossbow. And I think that that is an element of the game that was just kind of forgotten in development and greatly overlooked. So in a sequel, I would hope that they give it either much more focus or just cut it, because I think sometimes it's better to not have anything at all than to have a clunky gameplay system that's underutilized. Beyond controls, though, one of the other frustrations I think a lot of people have with the combat system, myself included, is the over-reliance on dodging and quen. I don't think parries are rewarded to the player anywhere near enough for getting the timing right, especially for monsters. With human fights, I can understand that it's fairly easy to implement, but for monster fights or hunts, if you land a parry on a given attack, there's just nothing really given to the player by way of weak point exposition or in terms of stun locking the enemy or maybe knocking it down. There's nothing like that in the game. And so the player is never really encouraged to train themselves or practice with those parries. I was even talking to a buddy of mine recently about The Witcher 3 combat because I was preparing this video and the outline and everything. And when I mentioned parries, he's like, there are parries in The Witcher 3? I was like, exactly. Because for a lot of people, they never dealt with it. They didn't realize, oh, yeah, I guess I remember you could tap left trigger, and if you timed it right, it would like do a parry, but I guess I never really thought about that. Huh? Who would have thought? Because they never needed to. And that goes back to my point about the difficulty, where the game has been balanced in a way where a lot of players can just totally ignore entire gameplay systems, which are pretty impressive or reliable or interesting, just because they don't need to. They never need to engage with parries or careful blocks or anything like that, because they can just kind of brute force their way through, because the game is easy enough to allow them to do that. Whereas when you play on Death March, for example, you probably need to learn how to do parries, whether it's fist fighting or whatever else. The over-reliance on Quen I just mentioned is also something I talked a lot about in my initial critique of The Witcher 3. I feel like for a lot of builds, it's just kind of assumed that you're going to be taking Quen and using it a lot, upgrading it a lot. And funnily enough, this is actually something I've found myself disagreeing with old Luke on. And I think part of the reason why I disagree with my old self on this point is because in the last few years, I have tried many different builds as I've replayed The Witcher 3 over and over again. And I've experimented with alchemy builds. I've experimented with builds that are focused on crit damage and acquiring adrenaline points to boost crits and using decoctions that will do that. And as I've done all of it, I've learned that, frankly, you can rely on Quen, but as you get more comfortable with the game, with dodges, with parries, as you start to really understand certain enemies and fights more and more, and you just frankly get better at the game, you don't need to rely on Quen anywhere near as much. And when you force yourself into upgrading other signs like Axii or Igni or something, you can really find yourself landing in some interesting builds and interesting play styles that you weren't familiar with before. And it forces you to play maybe more aggressively, as opposed to the more slow and methodical play style that something like Quen allows. So I think back in 2017, when I was playing The Witcher 3, I was playing with pretty normal builds. I wasn't experimenting with a lot of different variations with them. And as I've done that more and more over the years, I've come to appreciate Quen for what it is, but I also appreciate the other signs significantly more. But I will say that I think certain signs like Yrden and Igni also are greatly underutilized. I feel like there could be much more potency found within these. There could be a lot more powerful effects of signs, even if they are on greater cooldowns or if they require certain very specific conditions to be really, really useful. Maybe you throw the oil vial and then you use Igni, and that does extra super powerful fire damage to the griffin that you're fighting or whatever, at the cost of the trophy that you get at the end of it being ruined. So maybe you get a lesser payout. There's all sorts of cool ways that they could implement more powerful signs, and I hope that they do that with the next game, because as of right now, it feels like the signs are just like cool little abilities, but it doesn't feel like it's the really potent tool that Witchers pretty much exclusively have access to in the world of The Witcher. So I think there's a lot of potential that as of right now has been left untapped, but Quen specifically, I think calling it totally overutilized or something that is broken in the game is probably a little too heavy-handed for me in 2024, though I understand why Luke of 2017 would think that. Another thing that I both want to compliment and critique at the same time are the decoctions and oils. As I alluded to a moment ago, I think these are really cool and very useful when you play on higher difficulties. But it's really unfortunate that more players don't experiment with these in their first run-throughs, because frankly, most people, when they play games, they only play them once. And if that first run-through doesn't expose them or force them into using these, they will be totally unaware of the frankly awesome effects that some of these can have, especially when you start really experimenting with different builds. Real quick, Luke from the future coming in just real quick. In a second, I talk about combat and oils and stuff like that. And the way I phrased it isn't super clear, so I just want to be clear here. The oils, there is like a toggle in the menus to auto apply them when you enter combat. So if you start combat with a bunch of just guards or bandits or something, it will auto apply the Hangman's oil, which gives you improved damage against humanoid creatures, for example, or other ones against vampires or whatever. I kind of gloss over or don't mention specifically that it is an option in the menus to toggle on. I recall it as being auto-enabled by default, but at this point, I've played the game so much, I don't know what the default is, or if it was there at launch. So in the coming sections, I'm going to talk about that, the auto application of the oils, because as far as I know, it's an auto toggle. It's on by default, but maybe it isn't. I do think it's a good toggle to have on the whole, because it does save a ton of time toggling through menus and trying to find which oil to apply before each and every combat encounter. Like, nothing kills the pace of a combat encounter more than entering it, being like, oh, I'm in combat. Menu, toggle, toggle, toggle. Wait, this monster is what kind of monster? Open the bestiary in that menu, look through there. Oh, it's this type. Okay, back out of the menu, go over to the inventory, apply that oil, and then go into combat. It kills all of the immersion. It kills the pace. So I understand why the auto toggle is there, but I do want to clarify it is a toggle in the menus. And so you can turn it on or off. I want to be clear about that in case anybody was like, actually it's in the menus. You can turn it off if you don't like it. So just clarifying that. Okay, back to what I was saying. The first thing I want to tackle is the auto application of oils. This initially sounds really cool, but I actually don't like it after thinking about it a little bit more. For one, navigating menus in The Witcher 3 is pretty clunky and time consuming. The animations are slow and there's a lot of tabs to sift through before you get to the thing you want to get to. So having a toggle for auto application of oils, again, sounds interesting enough, but it isn't the end-all be-all solution that it's cracked up to be. For one, it leads to encounters that tend to be very homogenous. There's not many instances where you'll be fighting humanoids and maybe a werewolf at the same time, or humanoids and some sort of insectoid creature at the same time. Typically, you fight one type of creature at a time, partially because that's just how they have it set up, and also partially because if you had multiple types of creatures in an encounter, you would need to apply multiple oils on higher difficulties to even stand a chance, because the game is balanced as if you are using those oils. And so the game would just start to collapse. Maybe you could have a really easy time fighting the humanoid enemies, but the vampire you're fighting at the same time is way too powerful and you can't deal any damage to him because you didn't apply the vampiric oil, you applied the humanoid oil. So they start as a really cool, useful tool, but once the designers assume that you have them and they know that they're going to be auto-applied, they just start to balance encounters as though you are using the oil because it's going to be auto-applied anyways, and they know you're going to be dealing whatever increased damage to that class, so they can stand to increase the health pool of that enemy to still make the fight somewhat engaging. And it just makes it so if you're not using oils on Death March, for example, you're gonna have a bad time, even though it feels like it should be something that's more intentional, whether you read the books or whether you even watch an episode and a half of the show before it gets really bad. You'll see that using oils and potions and things is a very intentional and carefully considered thing for Witchers. But in The Witcher 3, Geralt's just popping it back like Tic Tacs. It's crazy. So to put it simply, I feel like the way oils are implemented in The Witcher 3 effectively just bakes them into combat encounters on higher difficulties, which makes them, in effect, an afterthought. Players will work on collecting the necessary ingredients and getting the recipes. They'll make them at the alchemy station or wherever else they might do it, and then they forget about them quickly after that. Decoctions, on the other hand, are really, really cool and typically are more difficult to get the ingredients for and to put together. But once you actually start to experiment with them, there are really cool effects that can be comboed with others in very specific combat encounters and situations. Again, I love these so much, but that same friend I mentioned parries to, when I mentioned decoctions, they also were like, what are those, the potions? It's like, no, they're technically a separate thing. They're like super powerful sort of potions, but they have much longer lasting effects. And no, not ringing a bell. And he just totally forgot about it, if he ever encountered them at all. Because again, for a lot of people playing on normal, they'll never need to brew decoctions. They'll never need to brew oils, and they could, and the game would get significantly easier for them. But the game is almost balanced in a way where it's assuming you're not going to use those on lower difficulties and you'll only be using them on higher difficulties. It's really bizarre. Decoctions to me are one of the coolest things that The Witcher 3's combat system in general has to offer. These have really, really cool effects, and it's just frankly unfortunate that more people didn't experiment with them. I mean, seriously, just look at some of these. Reduces damage received based on armor and inventory weight. Less weight carried and lighter armor means less damage is taken. High risk, high reward, lighter armor and armor sets, and you actually can reduce damage that you're receiving. That's super, super cool. The bear pheromones, specifically bears will not attack the Witcher. Just kind of a fun, very specific thing. Black blood. Witcher's blood injures vampires and necrophages when they wound him. So 15% of damage is returned to them. That's super freaking cool. I love that. And again, this feels like The Witcher. And perhaps one of my biggest frustrations with The Witcher 3 is that when you really pause to think about it, a lot of the gameplay systems don't actually make you feel like a Witcher. They don't actually force you to play like a Witcher. You're doing other things, like popping potions like they're nothing. Isn't really a Witcher thing to do. It's usually, at least in the books, described as a much more intentional act that you carefully consider. These decoctions are a very specific thing. Imagine you're going into a quest or a hunt against a big bear or something, and you pop this so that he doesn't attack you. And you can just wail on him, kill the bear without having to really receive any incoming attacks at all. That is a really cool implementation of a decoction that you could carefully integrate and implement. Or maybe you're headed into a really crazy encounter with a ton of smaller grunt enemies. So maybe you use the Grave Hag decoction, which allows you to get this. Each foe slain accelerates vitality regeneration for the duration of the battle. 10 vitality regeneration per enemy killed during battle, and prior to that it was only 5 before patch 4.0, but now it's 10. Like, that's also a super cool idea. And I feel like so much of The Witcher 3, and we'll talk about the economy here in a minute, which is another instance of this. The Witcher 3 just kind of gamifies so much that at times you lose sight of what you're actually supposed to be, which is a Witcher. And sometimes, like, Witchers will have an easy time taking down monsters and things, but other times it's still very, very difficult. And in my opinion, there should be plenty of encounters that players have to go into very, very cautiously. Even though you are playing as Geralt of Rivia, you shouldn't just walk haphazardly into an encounter with a werewolf just because you have the oil that will auto-apply and you have a leveled up potion and you're playing on the normal difficulty. I feel like all of these should be dangerous encounters and should require players to be very intentional with what they do and how they prepare. In the same vein as all of these alchemical potions and brews, potions in general in the game are very, very weak at low levels. Once you upgrade them, they become useful, but especially for the first 20 or so levels, things like Swallow or Thunderbolt, which are pretty mainstay potions people will use, are very, very weak and frankly not particularly useful except for outside combat after an encounter. In my opinion, there are other upgrade routes to be pursued which will allow you to heal in combat, such as the Quen upgrade, which heals Geralt for damage received before it breaks, and other such things. I still remember the first time I brewed Swallow and I used it in a combat encounter and I thought it was glitching out because it was healing so slowly, but it just turns out that's what it is. I know the easy counter is just get good Luke, but I do think that that is a thing that is a frustration for a lot of players and perhaps turns them off from spending a lot of time collecting different materials to upgrade enhanced versions of potions they already have, because the base versions are so weak. They're like, is it even worth upgrading, or is it just going to be slightly better garbage? When it's much better garbage to the point where it's actually really, really useful, and like Superior Swallow is actually really, really good for you to have in your inventory. But I can understand why some players just get immediately turned off and will start carrying around loaves of bread and grilled chicken sandwiches instead. The other thing with potions that I'll just touch on briefly is that I really don't like how you get recipes for these. I understand that it makes sense for herbalists to have recipes for upgraded potions as you go through the game, but there's nothing more annoying than running around to 15 different herbalist icons you see on your map, fast traveling to each one until you find the specific recipe you need to craft an upgraded version of a potion you have. It's just infuriatingly wasteful in terms of the player's time, and I don't really like it. You could have other things such as the books or compendium or bestiary or other things that the Witchers already have in their possession, which tells them how to brew the upgraded version of the potions, but maybe it's gated and limited by ingredients that are extremely difficult to get or require you to be of a certain strength to take on that particular monster that has the blood or the feather or whatever that you need for brewing that potion. I just think it makes more sense to give the player character that knowledge and then allow them to craft it once they've gained the strength to collect the item necessary for it. And if they happen to get to that fight against that monster early and they do it and they overcome that challenge, great, reward them with that potion at that point. I just greatly prefer that than running around to a bunch of different shopkeepers and sifting through the menu with each of the icons looking identical, reading the title to see which one is the recipe that I need. I don't like that. I find it clunky. And I know some people are going to say, just look up in a guide which shopkeep has which recipe you need. And I understand that is a solution in 2024/2025, but for players playing this at launch, that is not necessarily a solution. Especially when even in this game, there are plenty of instances of not just Geralt doing reading and studying, but even in the opening sequence of The Witcher 3, when Geralt is having that dream, the whole point is that Ciri is studying books to learn how Witchers do things and take on certain encounters, how they focus on potion brewing and all of that. So no doubt Geralt possesses that knowledge too. It's just a little weird that he arbitrarily has to go find a recipe from some other dude when he probably should already know how to brew that potion. For Witcher 4, I hope that Ciri already knows all of this stuff and you can spend less time hunting down recipes and more time hunting down the ingredients, which I think will typically be more fun than just sifting through menus. And the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the combat system has to do with enemy movement and AI. I feel like the movement patterns and the AI of enemies in stealth sequences, for the very few that there are, and also within combat itself, it's all pretty lackluster. Enemies don't tend to have super varied move sets. They might have a half dozen to a dozen moves total over the course of an entire fight that they just repeat. And on higher difficulties, they may repeat them more frequently or more unpredictably, but in general, each fight is pretty easy to get through. I also think hitboxes in general are pretty sloppy and loose, and also AoE damage as calculated from certain enemies that have, for example, slam attacks are also really inconsistent, with the particle effects often not clearly indicating where the range of damage ends and starts. I've played a lot of The Witcher 3, and there are still times when a monster will do a big slam attack and I get hit or my Quen shield gets broken even though I was comfortably far away from them. It's again just clunky. And I think the Phantom Liberty expansion doubly shows that they can learn from these mistakes and tighten all of this up. A lot of The Witcher 3 is just rough around the edges. It's just clunky. Sure, part of that carries charm, no doubt, but there are also plenty of instances where it's just actively annoying or infuriating. The next thing I want to touch on are the skills in The Witcher 3. A lot of this is actually addressed, or at least attempted to be addressed, in the Blood and Wine expansion with the mutagen system that they add, but again, we'll get to that here in just a little bit. In the base game, though, I feel like the skill system is pretty solid. There's a lot of interesting things to research and to use and apply. The way they tie them together with the little mutagens that you'll be collecting as you go through the game is cool to enhance the effect of the skills that you select. And the way that they color code them makes them really easy to understand. And it's a system that I just think is really clean to look at and it's easy to understand. But on the flip side, I do think that most players are going to be pursuing similar builds when they start the game. And there's not a lot of encouragement for respecking or for trying different build patterns. There are ways that you can respec in the game, specifically the Potion of Clearance, which can be bought from these people in The Witcher 3. You can see some of these are available in the base game, but most of them are available in Blood and Wine, which makes sense because they kind of assume you're going to be doing a lot of respecking once you get to that level 40 to 45 that you'll be most likely for Blood and Wine. So that checks out. But this item costs 1,000 crowns. Like, it is expensive, especially because, as we'll talk about in a minute, the economy in The Witcher 3 is one of its weakest points. And for players, especially in the early game, they will not have money to buy one of these just casually. And even if they do, they probably don't want to spend it on a respec when they're still actively leveling up and unlocking things. So I just think The Witcher 4, however they choose to go about skill systems and things like that, I hope they give players the chance to experiment a little bit more with different play styles. Because for a lot of players, I think they go through just leveling up the light attack, the heavy attack, and then maybe they upgrade Quen and maybe Igni a little bit. And then they get a couple of specific skills that let them like cast signs with adrenaline points instead of the stamina that they have. And that's how most people, I think, play the game. I would actually love to know if they have stats on what type of builds the majority of people choose, but I'm guessing that's probably how most players went through The Witcher 3 on their first playthrough. And it was only in subsequent playthroughs or New Game Plus that they started experimenting with things like alchemical builds or builds that are about min-maxing damage and toxicity and things like that, which are really, really cool, but are not really communicated clearly or explored at all in the base game. And to a certain extent, I can understand that for some people, they're just going to say, hey, that's normal for an RPG. Most players will play a pretty standard, unexciting build for their first run, and it's only in subsequent runs where you really start to experiment a lot. Maybe that is just part of the RPG experience, but I do think so long as we're dreaming that we can ask that The Witcher 4 does something to encourage players to experiment a little bit more. Maybe it's a free potion of clearance that you get after 5 to 10 hours and they encourage you to use it, or maybe even they force you to use it so you are encouraged to try something else. Something like that could be an easy fix to this so that players have a little bit more variability in their builds in what is, after all, supposed to be an RPG. But you know what? We've bounced around it enough. Let's talk now about the economy and loot in general in The Witcher 3. This is probably one of the weakest points in the entire game. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how a lot of the things you do in The Witcher 3, weirdly enough, don't make you feel like you're a Witcher. In The Witcher 3, you do get paid out crowns and other such currencies for doing quests and completing monster contracts and things like that. You find some loot in the world and some currency that way. But most of the way you make money in The Witcher 3, for most players, I think, is going to be collecting garbage and loot like swords and armor pieces from fallen foes, and then selling that to vendors. And even this process is prolonged often because by default, most merchants don't have a lot of money. So you sell a ton of stuff to one vendor, then you run across the street, sell a ton of stuff to that vendor, run across the street to the other vendor, and sell even more stuff over there until eventually you've exhausted everything in your inventory and you repeat the process, gaining money that way. I was baffled back when The Witcher 3 originally launched because it felt like your pay for some of these Witcher contracts was not very high at all. Like you would slave away for days on end to kill a griffin and they give you like 100 crowns and that's it. And you're like, bro, this isn't like enough to get one potion I need, and maybe that's tonally what's accurate. But when you get into the game 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours deep, it still holds true that you can make way more money collecting 15 swords and 20 pieces of armor to lug to a nearby merchant to sell instead of doing what a Witcher should be doing, which is not peddling junk, but is being a Witcher and witchering, if that's a word, going and killing monsters and beasts. In my opinion, The Witcher 3, or perhaps The Witcher 4, would be much better served if the vast majority of your income came from completing maybe even radiant, dynamic monster hunt contracts where you are tasked with, oh, there's another griffin that just popped up in White Orchard after I killed the other one. It just came back. There's another one. And this is like a legendary one. Maybe it's like all black feathers and it's super powerful. It's going to be really, really tough. But if I defeat it, I'll get like 5,000 crowns. And I can use that to level up Corvo Bianco and it's going to be great. That makes sense to me because that's Geralt being a Witcher. It's called The Witcher, for God's sake. Like, you should be doing Witcher stuff. It's always bugged me that so much of The Witcher 3 is spent doing things a Witcher, frankly, shouldn't be doing and wouldn't be doing, and that their time would be much better served doing other things. Maybe this is just me. Maybe this is a frustration I just have, but it's a common thing that I feel like is actively infuriating. Like, I don't want to be playing garbage collector in RPGs, whether it's Fallout 4 or Fallout 3 or New Vegas or Skyrim or The Witcher 3 or whatever. I just don't like it. It drives me up the wall. I know some people love the inventory management stuff and they love collecting a bunch of crap and then selling it all off. I get that. Some people love it, but to me, it drives me crazy. I just cannot stand it. And again, it's made all the worse because the economy in The Witcher 3 is really unbalanced. You will need money for various things, whether it's armor or equipment or ingredients for potions or recipes for those potions. But the money is never an easy thing to come by, not because you are incapable of completing contracts or side quests to collect it, but because the payouts from those side quests and from those activities are often so low, you need to supplement it by going and playing garbage collector. This is something I think they could definitely fix in The Witcher 4 and very clearly address in The Witcher 4, but it's something they need to understand from the ground up because this was also a major problem in Cyberpunk 2077. They got better with it in the Phantom Liberty expansion, and they redid and overhauled a ton of the economy stuff and a ton of the loot systems and all of that. So I think they learned from it and got much, much better. But this is something that was a problem in 2 back-to-back games, The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk, and I really hope they address it for The Witcher 4, because I swear to God, if I'm playing as Ciri, like Ciri in The Witcher, and I'm running around collecting garbage to sell to vendors to make ends meet, like that's going to drive me up a wall. But again, that might just be me. The other thing that frustrated me in the same context of the loot system is that there isn't really a clear home base for Geralt in the base game. This is something they of course addressed in the Blood and Wine expansion with Corvo Bianco, the villa that you get and that you can call home. But in the base game, it really feels like there's no place for Geralt to go and just kind of collect himself, to go drop off all of your loot. Yes, there is Kaer Morhen, and you are encouraged later in the game to go back there and kind of call that home. But that happens later on in the game, and it still is clunky because you have to do a separate load screen to fast travel all the way to there. And it still isn't really Geralt's place of home. It's just The Witcher place of home. So it still is just not quite what I was looking for. This again is just a personal thing. I love player homes. I love having property or real estate in a game like this to be able to go and place things that I've collected as I've gone on my adventures. For example, earlier I alluded to the sword that you get from Olgierd von Everick if you happen to save him in the confrontation with Gunter O'Dim. And it's such a beautiful sword. I think a lot of people don't want to just sell it for scraps, so they're going to take it back to Corvo Bianco and put it on the wall in a display, kind of like my sword that's back there. I love that kind of thing. I think it's great. Even games like Breath of the Wild do that with the little bitty house that you can get next to the river. What was it called? I forgot. Oh yeah, here it is. Oh, this is a throwback. Yeah, it's the house you can buy in West Necluda in Hatino Village. And you buy it from these guys after you pay 3,000 rupees and 30 bundles of wood. And then you get your little house where you can put weapons on display if they're really pretty and you're really proud of them. I love this kind of thing in games. I love it. And the fact that we eventually got it in Blood and Wine, I think is a great, great addition. And I hope we have something similar in The Witcher 4 for the base game, not just an expansion or something. I hope that we get that. But real quick, we have more to go through with problems and little issues in The Witcher 3, but my voice is going out and it's 5, so I've got to go hang out with my family and have dinner. So, quick time out. I'll be back after a costume change, rocking and rolling, okay? Magic of YouTube videos, isn't it great? Jacob, transition. Okay, there we go. It wasn't that cool? Isn't that high tech? That's why they pay me the big bucks, right? The next thing I want to discuss is the AI in general, both for NPCs, monsters, and companions. Generally speaking, the NPCs in this game are pretty stupid. They walk with blank expressions through the cities to given points and objectives, and often they'll just walk in circles if you follow them long enough. As far as I can tell, there are no routines, day-night jobs, or assignments to any of the NPCs, which is pretty standard for an open world game like this from 2015. They don't have a lot of dynamic responses to things the player can do, whether you bump into them, try to talk to them, do something crazy in front of them. It's all pretty bog standard. The one cool thing is that there are classist tendencies among the NPCs and within the dialogue, as I alluded to earlier, but they don't really react differently based on Geralt's clothes, weapons, cleanliness, or anything else like that. And it's too bad because there are systems in the game to go to a barber, for example, get clean shaven, or they have many times throughout quest lines opportunities to dress up and wear nicer clothes, for example. It's something that many characters will tell you to do throughout the game and the DLCs, and yet it doesn't really have any effect on the NPCs. If you are wearing a bunch of rundown beggar's clothes, or if you're running around in your boxers, the NPCs have no like real different response to you. Shopkeepers don't really react differently to you or anything based on that stuff. And I know not every game can be Kingdom Come Deliverance, but I would love it if this game, for a sequel like The Witcher 4, introduced some more stuff like that. If you just got out of a crazy fight against a monster and you're covered in mud and gross sweat and muck and stuff, I would love it if you went into town and people had comments about that. If you could go to a tavern or an inn and bathe and then people treat you better, or maybe shopkeepers offer you better prices. Stuff like that is really good for immersion, and I just love those kinds of smaller details on the sim side of the game. So I would love it if they overhauled the AI to account for that type of thing. On the companion side, there aren't companions in the same way there are in the Mass Effect games, for example, but there are many quest lines where you will be paired with one or more NPCs to go through the level with you. This is usually done for narrative reasons, to exposit some more information, or to explore relationships between the characters, but the NPC companions in these quest lines are often more followers than they are companions. One of the things I love most about like the original Last of Us game, for example, is how Naughty Dog found a way to actually grow the bond between the player and Ellie and Joel by encouraging them to interact with each other through gameplay. So as you go through levels and you're completing different puzzles, or you're navigating the level by moving ladders and lifting them up and then helping Ellie get over there so you climb up there, it's a way for the player to learn to rely on Ellie, and then also indirectly for Joel to learn to rely on Ellie, and for Ellie to learn to rely on Joel. It's a really cool way that you can kind of condition the player into feeling the same way as the characters on screen. And I just think it's brilliant. And it's something Naughty Dog, for example, in years past has been really good at. And I'm hoping that for a future Witcher entry, we see more of that. Cyberpunk 2077 was much better at it. They had a lot more interesting companions, and they were much more useful, helping hack stuff or open doors for you, or giving you unique dialogue, for example. And that's not really anything that we see in The Witcher 3. So that is definitely a spot for improvement, and it's one that they already took steps to improve in Cyberpunk, so I have no doubt it's going to be even better in The Witcher 4. But one thing I'm not so sure will be improved is the UI, and maybe this is controversial of me, but I think the user interface in The Witcher 3 and even Cyberpunk 2077 is extremely obtuse. That's a weird word choice, I grant you. I don't know why that felt appropriate when I was writing the outline, but what I really mean is that it just has many steps to do things you're going to do a lot, presumably, like looking in the bestiary, or going and needing to manually apply oils to your weapons if you don't have the auto apply toggle on, or going into the menus to select a decoction that you don't have already applied to the quick use. It's really time consuming to open the menu, wait for it to pull up, and then to tab over, and then to go down and tab over within the sub menu to get to the thing you need, and then to read each of the descriptions. It's just very laborious, and it's also that way in Cyberpunk 2077, and this is also made worse by the excessive amount of loot and garbage and things that you get as you play through the game. And so without a doubt, I think they could totally streamline this and improve it. Now, they did streamline inventory management and loot at the end of the Cyberpunk story, specifically with Phantom Liberty. They overhauled a ton of that with Cyberpunk 2.0. So I do know they are aware of it, and they took steps to try and deal with it and fix it. But I'm worried that The Witcher 4 is going to be plagued by similar things, especially because for whatever reason, if somebody out there that is a game dev knows, please tell me, but it feels like Unreal Engine games, for whatever reason, have problems with like really snappy menus. I didn't notice this until I sat back and like started thinking about it when I was outlining this. I was like, actually, a lot of Unreal Engine games, for whatever reason, have kind of sluggish menu navigation. I don't know if that's just a coincidence with a lot of games that use it or what, but like it's a little bizarre that a lot of games have that problem. So I hope that that's something that they improve in The The Witcher 4, because anytime you have a little speed bump in the way of the player when they want to do something, when you multiply that across 100 hours of gameplay when they're trying to do something over and over and over again, it just wastes time. And I think that's unnecessary when we talk about a game like this. If you can streamline it, make it smoother, do it. I meme on Bethesda Game Studios all the time, but one thing I will give them so much credit for is overhauling the menus, specifically within adventuring and looting with Fallout 4 and Starfield. They did a tremendous job rethinking how that should work, and the ability to just go through the game, look at an object like a box or a body, and be able to loot it with that intelligent menu that just pops up without pausing the game or freezing it. It is so fluid, it is so fantastic, and I cannot praise it enough. It really does make every other Fallout game that doesn't have that, Fallout 3, New Vegas, you name it, all of them feel so slow in comparison, and I hope little quality of life improvements like that also find their way to The Witcher 4. I know Cyberpunk 2077 featured the same sort of intelligent menu that pops up when you're looting bodies, so I hope that they bring that to The Witcher 4 as well. Another point to bring up in the same family of topics as user interface and menus would have to be the maps and quest tracking. Personally, I don't really love it when narrative open world games rely a lot on mini maps, like in the corner of the screen. I don't know why, it just bugs me. I think it's because when you're playing a game like this, I think you should be as immersed as you possibly can. And having a map constantly on screen pointing you exactly where you should go, I just think can pull you out of that immersion, because you'll start to stare at it, figuring out where you need to go, instead of thinking about where you're standing and where you need to go based on the instructions from the quest giver. Funnily enough, The Witcher 3 actually has something really cool built into it that not many people realize, and that is like very, very specific quest instructions. It's not true for every single quest in the game, but for most of them, especially in the main story quest lines, characters will tell you where to go for an objective, and they'll describe it well enough that you can find it without any minimap or without any quest icons or anything above the point that you're trying to reach. They'll say like, go down the road, look for the building with the red door, and then it's the next house on the left. And you can follow those instructions, and sure enough, that's where the quest objective is. It's a different way to play, and you might even find yourself playing with like a notebook next to you to write down the instructions. But again, if we're talking about immersion, it's a great way to do it. The other easy solution a lot of games have employed is just to use a compass instead of a mini map, and I think that's a great middle ground where you can still direct players where they need to go, but it's not so distracting as an actual mini map that floats on screen. I know some people don't really care about it. Either which way, they'll point to games like Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, which by default has a mini-map, but even Red Dead Redemption 2 allows you to toggle the menus such that that mini-map becomes a compass instead. So they give you the option to play in that more immersive way, which I can at least appreciate that there is that option. But I do want to just point out that it is something that the designers of The Witcher 3 and the writers considered, and they put that in there if you want to turn off the minimap. And if you're looking to play through the game again, maybe this video inspires you. Try going through, turning off the minimap and playing the game like that and seeing how much more immersed you feel. It's actually pretty cool. And lastly, when we talk about the user interface, I hate to be that guy once again, but the detective mode in this game is hot, steamy garbage. I get it. Geralt has supernatural senses. He can smell things. He can see things we can't see. I understand the need for the detective mode. I get it. But my God, I cannot tell you how many times I'm holding down that left trigger button, even now, all these years later after playing The Witcher, and Geralt will just run too fast over where I'm trying to look, or he'll miss one of the footprints or the smell trail, and it just doesn't trigger quite right. And so you end up having to just stand there circling with the fisheye lens effect, trying to see what you need to see. And I know you can turn that off in the settings, but you get what I mean. I think it's way too clunky. It's way too clunky. And I hope more than anything else in the UI department that I've brought up, okay, maybe the menus are up there too, but I really hope they overhaul that detective mode when it comes to The Witcher 4, because the detective sequences in The Witcher 3 are my least favorite in these quest lines, because it just slows everything down. It's clunky and awkward and weird. And there are some customizations you can do with mods, for example, to make it so Geralt always walks when he's in detective mode, or to change it so like the detective mode icons pop faster and the points of interest pop faster and stuff like that. But still, I just think it needs a fundamental redesign. So I am hopeful we get that with The Witcher 4. Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the story and quest design in The Witcher 3. As I've said 1,000 times, I love the story of The Witcher. I love the questing. I love the quest design in general. And really, at the end of the day, what makes The Witcher 3 so special in my view is that every quest, everything you do, has a story attached to it. Even like the monster Witcher contracts to go and hunt a monster, even those have stories usually attached to them to go and find this thing because it's affected this group of people in this way. So you're encouraged to do that. I love it, and that's what motivates the player to go do those things beyond just loot and rewards, which, as I said earlier, I feel like the rewards even for those contracts aren't very good. So the fact that the player still feels motivated to do that, I think is a testament to the writing and not an excuse for the rewards to be bad. That being said, there are some weird eccentricities with how The Witcher 3's narrative has been set up, and specifically the quest lines have been set up. And I think it's a remnant of the development cycle, but I could be wrong about that. What I mean is that the first third or half of the game, I'm not exactly sure how it splits up, is dedicated to finding Ciri, and they give you broad guidelines. Look for Ciri in White Orchard, look for Ciri in Skellige, look for Ciri in Novigrad. Like, they tell you roughly where to go, and that kickstarts quests like the Bloody Baron questline and others. And that's all fine, but what I think it is it's a remnant of how they built the game, where they had a team of devs that were working on White Orchard, and then they have another team of devs that's working in Skellige, and they have another team over here in Novigrad, and they break it up like that so that the dev teams can specialize and focus on what they need to do and see every questing area to its completion, and each one will feel different, have that different vibe and music and style and everything. And I really like that. But what I think it did is, because of that, they just treated each of those areas, each of those chunks of the game as their own smaller game. And so pacing wise, it feels really off. And then when you finally discover Ciri and everything kind of gets resolved and it's like, okay, the team's together, it just kind of feels a little anticlimactic for whatever reason. I don't know if that's just me, but it's always just sat weird with me, the way it's set up, where it feels like they didn't really know how to kickstart the first third of the game, so they just let you wander. And maybe that's brilliant, because it's like, oh, you can go and explore freely. But it also feels like I should be racing to find Ciri. The stakes are pretty high, especially after the dream Geralt starts the game with, where she's about to be killed by the Wild Hunt. So I don't know. I don't know if it's just all these years later, it feels weird to me, but it's always felt off. In that same vein, I do want to point out that I've had this frustration with many other games, to be very clear. But if the player is being motivated to participate in the main story with a really serious emotional hook, in my view, it's usually not the best idea to then ask the player to engage in more casual activities at the same time. What I mean is that if you're going to tell me that, like, my character V in Cyberpunk is dying, I am actively dying and I need help, I can play through Cyberpunk's story and get to that 18-20 hour mark when you're about to meet Hanako at Embers and start the final quest line of the game. I can get there pretty quick, but if I'm fully immersed in the main story and I'm dying, I need a fix to this, I'm gonna go straight into that and try to resolve that problem, that very high stakes problem. But that isn't really what the devs want you to do. The devs want you to engage with the side content. They want you to take your time and explore and have fun. But in order to do that, you kind of have to turn your brain off and ignore the main story for a little while. Another, perhaps better example that I've used a lot is Fallout 4, where you literally watch your own child be kidnapped and you watch your spouse get murdered in front of you by very recognizable people. And then upon escaping into the vast wastes, you're asked to spend an hour or two customizing a little fort and clearing garbage in a neighborhood you used to live in. It's so weird. And maybe it's just because I'm a father of two very adorable little boys. It hits extra home to me, but the idea of my child being kidnapped and then me going and playing housekeeper it's so not right in my brain. I cannot fathom how to do that. And so when I play a game like Fallout 4, I get really immersed and I take the story seriously, and then I go and I do that and I end up not having a great time, because most of what makes Fallout 4 or Cyberpunk really good is the side stuff, the stuff that kind of pads the main story and fills out the entire game. And I just think if you have the wrong main story motivation for the player, it can often lead to a situation where players the more seriously they take the main story, the less fun they'll have. And I think that's bad, and I think that's an unnecessary problem to start with. If you start the game with something much more open-ended, then you can funnel players down with an intense narrative beat halfway through, or after all the side content, or after they've spent a lot of time doing side content, and then you motivate them after the fact. I think Baldur's Gate does a tremendous job of this, where you're kind of just adventuring and journeying to a given destination, but it's not like right now, you got to get there within 6 months, otherwise everybody dies. It's much more open-ended, and I think that's how you got to do it. And I hope that they do that with The Witcher 4, because the way they do it in The Witcher 3 feels just off, where Ciri is in danger. They start the game with this dream where she's about to be killed, and so clearly there's this threat you need to be worried about. And then you just spend the first 20, 30 hours of the game kind of hanging out and going around and talking to people and like checking out Kara Metz in the hot tub. Like, it's just weird. It feels weird to me. The other thing I don't remember having a problem with back when I played the game initially, but that I don't like as much now, is the Wild Hunt themselves. Honestly, I just don't find the Wild Hunt to be that compelling as an antagonist for the game. I feel like Hearts of Stone with Olgierd von Everick and then the sort of fake out to Gunter Odim is really, really good and handles this much, much better with antagonists that have nuance, but also are truly motivated to do what they're doing. And even in Blood and Wine with Detloff and then eventually Sienna, it works way better in my view. And I think that they figured this out as they worked on The Witcher 3 longer and longer. But I will be completely honest, this may just be my personal bias because I don't tend to like bad guys who do bad things because they're bad or because like, I need power for my people. Like, it's just not that interesting to me because it's like, yeah, they're doing what they're doing because you needed the bad guy to do this. I find it much more interesting if you have somebody that's doing bad things, but for a reason you can understand in their twisted perspective, whether it's like Sienna's the best example in Blood and Wine, or if you look at Olgierd von Everick, he's maybe less understandable, but he's still a tragic character, and there's sort of a redemption if you choose to save him at the end of Hearts of Stone. So it's interesting nonetheless, but I just don't think the Wild Hunt is that compelling an antagonist, frankly. Another thing that many people have criticized The Witcher 3 over has to do with its pacing within those main story quest lines. Specifically, for whatever reason, I have like a deeply entrenched memory of people saying, I don't like The Witcher 3. It's a cutscene simulator. It's basically just a movie. And nowadays you don't really hear people saying that, but back at launch, I remember that being a big point. People had tons of problems with how slow the game was, with how many cutscenes there were and how slow some of the dialogue was. And after playing through it again for this video, I can see what they mean. I can see how somebody that is used to maybe faster paced like narratives and stories could maybe feel that it's sluggish. I just happen to like it because it's written really well in my view. So I don't find it that sluggish, but maybe like for the younger generation, for the TikTok crowd, maybe for them it's too slow. I don't personally feel that it's too sluggish, but your mileage may vary. But I did want to bring that up because that was something that was discussed a ton when it came out, but nowadays you don't hear people really mentioning it, probably because we're all just too familiar with the game. But I hope that they do not listen to that feedback and dumb down the writing or streamline it, because I think the writing is one of the biggest strengths of this game that they shouldn't mess with. One thing they should mess with, though, in my view, is the quest design within the side content, specifically based around the tasks. Most of what you do in The Witcher 3 is either going and hunting some given enemy, or you go and you talk to somebody who then tells you to go and kill an enemy. Occasionally there will be a detective mode sequence where you are looking for the enemy you are tasked with killing, but on the whole, 99% of the time you're going to be killing something or fetching something. I personally just like more varied stuff, or if you have other gameplay systems that you can tie in, whether it's with puzzles or if it's with more carefully chosen dialogue options or clever ways of integrating other systems such as bartering or crafting. Whatever it is, just shake it up a little bit. I understand that The Witcher 3 was a product of its time, and for 2015, don't get me wrong, it is very, very impressive how much gameplay there really is. But in the context of modern gaming, I think players will expect a little more dynamism. Cyberpunk also did a great job with this, not just with big set pieces, but also with some quick time events within combat sequences. And I think they could do that with The Witcher 4 just fine. And I think that would be right at home. I mean, especially like big boss encounters, you could do some quick time event style stuff. Like for example, in the opening boss fight of the Phantom Liberty expansion against the gigantic spider mech, that boss fight and sequence seamlessly blends together both combat and then real-time gameplay and navigation, all mixed in with cinematics and quick time events so fluidly. It's frankly amazing. It's on the level of what Santa Monica Studio did with God of War Ragnarok and that gameplay, for example, in the fight against Thor, or even something like Naughty Dog in some of their big boss fights against the Rat King, for example, in The Last of Us Part 2 with Abby in the last half of the game or so. Staying in this vein with the quest design, I also just want to hammer home another point, which is that I feel in The Witcher 3, the monster contracts are way too streamlined, simple, and short. Many of these you can just encounter casually while exploring the world, which is fine. That makes sense that you would encounter monsters while exploring, but it often feels like boss fights against these monsters are not really boss fights. They're just quick encounters that take maybe 45 seconds to get through once you know what you're doing, and then you just move on with your day. In the opening of The Witcher 3, Geralt and Vesemir spend like days preparing for the fight against the Griffin. It's like a big deal. They have to set the trap, they have to go and wait for it to show up, and then it's like a multi-stage fight as he travels and moves somewhere else. It's like a big deal. And that's the last time a monster hunt is like a big deal in The Witcher 3, except for major plot points and story sequences. And I would like it if in The Witcher 4, fights against all of these monsters are on that level. I feel like you should be rewarded very handsomely if you kill, for example, a Kikimora, but I think that the way The Witcher 3 handles it is to just treat all of these monsters like fodder enemies unless they are in a main story sequence, and I just don't personally like that. If I'm gonna go and hunt like a very scary monster, I feel like I should have to earn that win even as a Witcher. You know, the reason that these civilians need to hire Witchers is because these monsters are so freaking dangerous. But in the books, in the games themselves, even in the world of CDPR's version of The Witcher, Witchers still die against monsters all the time. Geralt is a very good Witcher, no doubt, which is why he's so capable. But even he, in the books, will struggle against some of these fights. It shouldn't be a walk in the park where you can take them down in a minute or two like it's nothing when you just casually ran into them. And I hope that moving forward, that same tone and vibe is retained. I feel like Ciri, yes, she's very powerful, but she should also struggle against some of these fights. In that cinematic trailer they dropped at the Game Awards announcing The Witcher 4, I feel like they represented the fight that Ciri was faced with very, very well, where it was not an easy thing for her and it was very taxing and difficult. And I hope that that is something retained in the gameplay as well and not just in the cutscene. This is something maybe you guys will disagree with me on, and that's totally fine. I just tend to like with my RPGs the primary focus to be on immersion. And to focus on immersion also tends to mean that you are not going to be focused on approachability first and foremost, or ease. There will be times when you have to prepare. There will be times when you cannot take on that fight and you gotta leave until you are ready to take on that fight. And that's the kind of game that I really like. That's when I get really immersed into a game. It's why I love Kingdom Come Deliverance so much, for example. And I hope that they consider some of that for The Witcher 4, because I love that stuff. I love that stuff. And I know they're capable of it. It's going to be an active choice of whether they pursue that route. You know, if they want to go the route and make it more gamey or gamified, and it's like, ooh, it's a Leshen. Just go fight him real quick. Takes 2 seconds, unless it's a main story thing. So be it. So be it. If it's good in terms of combat and interesting, I'm sure it'll be fine and I won't care. But my ideal would be to make each and every monster fight significant, weighty, and make me earn it. If I'm gonna go complete one of those Witcher contracts, that should be an hour and a half thing in my view. Like, I should have to go make sure I've got all the oils, make sure I've got all of the decoctions I might need, all the potions I might need. I need to go set up camp outside the thing's den. I need to read the bestiary article and figure out, oh, it's got a weak spot on its back right here. Okay, I'm gonna do that. All that should factor in, and I shouldn't be able to just waltz in and fight it. That's my ideal. I'll leave it there. Feel free to agree or disagree in the comments. I'm actually really interested to hear if you guys like the more serious, like grounded approach to those encounters, or if you like it more gamified. let me know. Another thing I should probably touch on that I have not really touched on is probably Gwent. I don't have anything bad to say about this. I like Gwent a lot, and I'm glad it's in the game, and I'm glad that it seems like it's confirmed to be returning to The Witcher 4. So there you go. I really like how Gwent, I made a joke about it earlier in the video, but I really like how Gwent is like the one unifying force in this whole dark, gritty world where everything's awful. Different classes of people hate each other. The rich hate the poor and the poor hate the rich. And, you know, this group hates this other group because they're on the other team in this big global conflict. But the one thing they all love is Gwent. And no matter what, Geralt can make friends by just playing Gwent. I think it's fantastic. I love it, and I'm glad it's making a comeback. Nothing bad. I just want to get Gwent out there and say that I appreciate that. And you can make an entire video like this on Gwent within The Witcher 3 because there's so much variability there with collecting cards and then traveling and exploring the maps and buying cards from different sellers and collecting their cards and stuff. There's a lot there. I mean, this video is long enough, so I'm not going to get into it really, but Gwent, good. That's what I'm saying. My second to last pet peeve with The Witcher 3 has to do with performance and the game's tech. I touched on this earlier, but the game was really, really buggy when it launched, and they kind of got away with it because it didn't pop off in terms of popularity till later in 2015 and then into 2016 with the expansions that were very, very well reviewed. So they kind of dodged the criticism bullet initially, and then they ran face first into it with the feedback for Cyberpunk. And that seems to have kicked them in the teeth enough that they have learned their lesson and are not going to have a repeated disastrous launch like that. Knock on wood as best we can. But I do want to just say performance is an issue. Even like today in The Witcher 3, there's still problems even after the DirectX 12 update that they did, adding ray tracing, DLSS and that stuff. It still is like a little clunky. Performance isn't great. There's still random frame drops even on my supercomputer. So I do think optimization is a thing that will need to be focused on, especially considering this is going to be an Unreal Engine 5 game. And Unreal Engine tends to struggle a lot when it comes to open world games. So fingers crossed they really polish this up and get it running smooth, because typically Unreal Engine games are extremely heavy to run, meaning you need really powerful hardware, and they have weird eccentricities with like stuttering, with like shader compilation issues and all sorts of stuff. So I'm sure they're aware of all of that. Like, no doubt they're aware of all of it. I just hope that they address it before the game launches. And sort of related to this, I do want to say that I hope, as I alluded to earlier, that the map for the next game is just one gigantic place, at least for most of the games, so that there's not constant load screens when you want to go back and forth between places, or at the very least minimal load times between them. In The Witcher 3, load times are notoriously long and slow, especially on consoles, and I hope that is also something that's streamlined and improved when it comes to The Witcher 4. I know it was improved a lot with Cyberpunk 2077 after the 2.0 update on modern consoles and PCs, so I'm sure that this is a priority for them as well. But here we are at my last and perhaps most controversial frustration with The Witcher 3. Prepare to either agree forcefully or disagree fervently. Are you ready? Fast travel. I think they should get rid of it. Fast travel in games like these, I feel, encourages the player to just ignore a major component of the game's design. These are open world games. They're about exploration, discovering cool things around nooks and crannies, and encountering crazy NPCs or monsters along the way as you ride from one city to the next. And fast travel is literally just skipping that. Like, fast travel is giving the player a way to skip something the dev team spent months or years building. And that's just never really made sense to me, except in the context of some games where it's either so bland, empty, and boring that there's nothing new to be discovered as you explore it, or if the game is so tedious with like loot management, inventory management, that type of thing, that you just need to fast travel back and forth to your stash as you're exploring. But I don't think that, like, that's just two problems. Like, that's not actually, I think, a solution to fix the loot problem. That way you don't need the fast travel. That's my opinion. But having said that, I really get frustrated when games have a reliance on fast travel for questing, when they have a reliance on fast travel for navigation in general. I also think it tends to slow down the game pace a lot, especially if load times are large. And say it with me, it's immersion breaking. To pull up a menu and then have to sit for it while it loads you into a new area, I just don't think that's good. The more time the player can be in the game and the less amount of time the player spends in menus or load screens, the better. I know this upcoming game is going to be on next gen tech, and it'll be on PS5 and Series X and PCs that have NVMe SSDs, and The Witcher 3 didn't have any of that. I get that. But even if this is like a sort of God of War fast travel where it opens a white portal door and you walk through, flash of white light, and then you arrive at your next destination, I think that is like the only way I would be okay with fast travel. If it's an actual menu, if it's an actual loading screen with the bar, I'm out. I think we should get past that. I think it's stupid. And I think, again, it's okay to entrust players with finding their way to and from places without fast travel. Like, I think it's okay if you explore this corner of the map and then they need to ride their horse back to where they were going. I think that will let them appreciate how big the map is. And hopefully you've built in some things for dynamic encounters, whether that's bandits on the roadways waiting for you, or it's a monster that attacks you as you're riding. That's all great, fine and dandy. And I think that that's what can allow the player to become even more immersed in the world that you have built. The only sort of exception beyond the white door that I could be convinced of is if they did, again, no shocker, like the Kingdom Come Deliverance way of doing fast travel, which is an actual simulated travel. If you've not played that game, basically if you want to fast travel somewhere, it pulls open the menu, it shows the little icon traveling along the road, and then it will simulate things based on the time of day, where you are, what you're wearing, that type of thing. And so if you are, for example, walking on foot in the middle of the night through a dark forest, you probably are going to get jumped by bandits. And if that happens, you actually get torn out of the fast travel and you have to deal with it yourself. You can't just fast travel around it. But if you are riding on a horse on a Sunday afternoon through a large open field, that fast travel will happen quickly and effortlessly without any issues whatsoever. So it retains some of the sim and immersive elements while still saving the player time if you don't want to have them manually ride or walk everywhere they need to go. But I will be completely honest, fast travel in games is just one of my personal pet peeves, because it drives me crazy that devs would spend years building this immersive world and then would give you a way to skip it. It's bizarre to me. It's like if I gave you, like I spent years writing a book and I give you the book and then I'm like, so here it is, all those chapters, 500 pages. Okay, and then here are the spark notes. Like, why? Why did you give me the book? Why did you go to the trouble of writing the book if you're just going to give me the spark notes to get the gist and just kind of glaze over it? Like, yeah, we ended up with the same important information. We got where we needed to be. But then why did you build this entire book? Like, what are you doing? That's what it feels like to me. And maybe I'm weird for that, but I want to say it because it's probably my most controversial opinion about most of these open worlds, is that I think in general, if you scrapped fast travel and you built the game around fast travel being gone, I think those games would be much, much better and more immersive. The problem is when you have a game that was built for fast travel and then you remove fast travel, that doesn't work because it's going to be big and empty and boring. But again, you get what I mean. Moving on. With all that having been said, those are my broad issues and praises for the Witcher 3 base game. And as I've alluded to a few times, the expansions fixed and dealt with a lot of this stuff quite well, either enhancing the already good stuff or straight up fixing problems that many people had with the base game. Whether that's gameplay systems, such as the lack of end game support for Geralt at high levels, which is addressed in the Blood and Wine expansion with the mutations system we'll talk about in just a few minutes, or if it's something more narrative with players that wanted some more varied quest lines, both varied in tone and also in style and questing, as we saw with the Hearts of Stone expansion, whether you look at deals being made with the devil, giant boss fights against frogs. I was going to call them like cursed princes, but it's a frog. Let's be honest, it's a frog. So yeah, that, or participating in wedding games at a small little wedding for a little village with Shani. There's so much variability here. The expansions are among the best probably for any game. of all time. As far as I'm concerned, these are some of the best expansions ever, and I want to go through why and how. So buckle up, buckaroo. Let's talk about Hearts of Stone and then Blood and Wine. And speaking of wine, I'm gonna go drink some and do a costume change. Ready, set, transition. Booyah. Okay, we're back. I want to talk about the expansions now. Now, we've talked a little bit about them in passing, so I'm not going to go too deep into each of these, but I do think there are certain elements of each of these expansions that show CDPR appreciated some of the critiques of the base game, and I'm sure those critiques were held even internally with the staff, because you got to remember, like, these expansions are in production before the final game launches. So if The Witcher 3 launches in May, they're probably working on these at the end of the year previous. I mean, they are building these, understanding things they wish they could change about the base game, because as with most creative processes, the most fierce critics are usually the ones actually making it themselves. And in this case, I think that that is accurate, because there's parts of Hearts of Stone where you can tell that they took some steps and there were some things they wanted to adjust in terms of structure and style and tone. And then there's other things they did with Blood and Wine where they really added and reworked some gameplay stuff because they had more of that feedback to work with, and they built most of that after the game had launched. So let's talk about each of them. The Hearts of Stone expansion is honestly probably one of my favorite expansions in the history of gaming. It adds a very interesting, compelling story. It is lean, mean, and extremely memorable. They were able to retain a lot of the feeling of the base game, but then they also paired it with bigger set pieces, like the fight against the Frog Prince, for example, or the painted world where you go in and speak to Olgierd's wife. It's really, really interesting how they've managed to retain that same feeling while also introducing new concepts and some new characters and things. And one of the also interesting things about the expansion is that it unlocks while you're playing through the base game. So you actually can play this before you've wrapped up the main story, and it's probably actually recommended because the game kind of scales as though you aren't quite finished. I believe you can typically finish the base game of The Witcher 3 in the late 30s, maybe early 40 level tier, but the Hearts of Stone expansion begins in the mid 30s in terms of level. So they kind of anticipate that once it unlocks, you're going to travel to the north end of the map and start working your way through it, maybe occasionally dipping back in later. But one of the giveaways of why they anticipate that you're probably going to play through this without having finished the base game is because, as I alluded to earlier, when you speak to Gunter O'Dim at the very end, assuming that you gave Olgierd over and didn't fight to save him, you can actually ask as your reward for advice on where to find Ciri if you haven't found her yet. And while he doesn't give it away, since it would just spoil the entire game and kind of break the main story quest line, Gunter O'Dim will tell you some tips on how to get the best ending, which I think is cool. Nonetheless, whenever you choose to go through the expansion, you will be greeted with a series of quests that are extremely varied, both in tone and also in presentation. The sequence with Shawnee at the wedding is very, very unique in the context of the broader game. There isn't really any quest line quite like it. Of course, Olgierd's brother introduces an interesting mechanic where they're able to get Geralt to loosen up and buddy up with Shawnee in a way where they wouldn't be able to normally, since Geralt, of course, has experienced the mutations and doesn't have the same emotional, let's just say, impulses that your average person would have. So seeing his body possessed by a party animal, basically, is an interesting change of pace and tone, and lets you see another side of Geralt that you probably didn't expect. It also focuses on an emotion that isn't really explored much in the base game, and that is the theme of regret. Most things you do in the Hearts of Stone expansion are tied to kind of hopes and dreams and what could have been if things were different. Whether you look at the relationship between Olgierd and his wife, or you look at Olgierd and his brother, or even Geralt and Shawnee. Like, there's so many interesting little layers to this narrative exploration that they do. And I do find it really interesting, especially if you happen to play through Hearts of Stone before you finished the base game, because I think it will inform how you interact with Ciri in that final confrontation as she heads up to the giant snowstorm and the ending is established. Because if you've explored these topics of regret and trusting each other and things, I think you could role play your way into a more interesting conclusion, or at least a more compelling conclusion than if you just raced straight from the beginning of the game straight to the ending and then went to Hearts of Stone. In terms of gameplay, there's not a ton here. There is the new rune write craftsman, I guess is what you would technically call them, but these are additional customization options to alter weapons and things like that. As you can see in this really solid breakdown with charts and everything in the IGN's guide, it's actually like quite expensive to get into it, not just 5,000 crowns and then a bunch of jade to get access to basic runes. But if you want the advanced runes, we're talking about 10,000 crowns, which is a lot of money, even in the later game or even after the base game going into like the Blood and Wine expansion. 10,000 crowns is a lot. And if you want the master crafted runes, these are as much as 15,000 crowns to let the rune write upgrade his tools and be able to do even better and more powerful ones. Granted, some of these are really cool, such as each unlocked potion increases potion duration time by 0.5 seconds. Some of these are really cool, to be fair, such as some of these which have like each unblocked blow increases potion duration time by 0.5 seconds, which can get straight up broken if you know how to do that. Eruption for armor, foes set alight by Igni explode when they die, setting other nearby enemies alight. Levity, all equipped armor items are treated as light armor, so if you want to go really heavy and customize your armor that way, you can do it. Grants 30% chance of returning a portion of damage received to the attacking foe through retribution. And each of these, of course, require greater glyphs of Quen or Igni or a greater glyph of reinforcement. Like, each of these are pretty expensive and are very much focused on players who are min-maxing and going into the much later game. Funnily enough, I think this system would have been more appropriate in the Blood and Wine expansion, because when this is introduced to players, I think they are gonna look at it, kind of scoff at the price, and frankly forget about it. That's at least what happened to me the first time I played through this, where I was like, as if I'm gonna spend 5,000 crowns on something like this. Because when you're looking at the initial ones that are available to you, armor deflection, you deflect all incoming arrows. Okay, I mean, I usually just dodge out of the way anyways. Armor table and grindstone bonuses never expire. That's cool. But is that 5,000 crowns worth? Any food consumer generates 100% more vitality, so it just doubles it. Okay, like they're good, but 5,000 crowns good? I don't really know about that. And so I think a lot of players scoff at the initial price and the barrier to entry when paired with the jade that's required to actually get this unlocked. And they're probably going to move on and forget about it. I think this would have been much more appropriate if added to the Blood and Wine expansion and part of that overall to the gameplay, because I think players would be much more equipped to tackle this. And you could, of course, scale a lot of the endgame enemies in the Blood and Wine expansion to require this. Some of them certainly are tough and do expect you to have a very high level, very powerful Geralt when you tackle it, but I just don't think this was integrated very well or communicated to the player that well. And frankly, I think a lot of players are not going to ever really mess with the rune rights, not just because it's not very well communicated or just because of the sticker shock that happens when they see the price of entry, but also because the game is balanced in a way where playing on normal, you really don't need to mess with this. And maybe that's by design, that you don't need to complete this side quest and get the rune rights at all. But I would say again, like, if you are adding a gameplay system to your video game, and then there is a way that players can go through the entire thing and never really mess with it at all, like, it probably wasn't that significant of an addition, frankly. Like, if it was really significant, all players would be engaging with it and checking it out, just like chasing gems in Monster Hunter or re-rolling armor pieces and stuff in ARPGs. If it's significant, players will engage with it. And if a lot of players, or even most players, can just totally ignore something and still get through the game just fine, it probably means that the system either wasn't sizable or significant, or the game is balanced to the point where it's too easy to really push people into exploring those options, because they're not hitting any of those walls where combat's getting really tough and enemies are really tough to take down, and they're like, what is the solution to this? And then they seek out the solution in the rune rights or other things like the additional mutations that they introduce in Blood and Wine. It's my humble opinion. I think playing on Death March can certainly help with this, because it will push you into exploring this stuff, but I experimented on this most recent run not messing with rune rights at all, and frankly I was able to get through Blood and Wine just fine without any of this. So even then, like on Death March, I just don't think it's really that necessary. It's a cool addition. conclusion, I appreciate the rune right system, but I think, again, it's just not integrated that well. And frankly, I think there's a lot of people who might be watching this video who have played The Witcher 3 a lot and might be surprised rune rights are a thing, since you need to complete a specific side quest in order to get access to it. And if you happen to not go to that board and pick up that notice to unlock the quest, a lot of players probably got through Hearts of Stone without realizing this was ever a thing. And I just personally think it sucks when there's an entire gameplay addition that a lot of players just never find out about. The one thing I think the rune right system could potentially do really, really well is it encourages players to go and check out upgrading or crafting specific armor sets or weapons, which I think is something, once again, that a lot of players will just ignore through the base game, since they're constantly unlocking new weapons that are better than the ones they previously had. And in that sense, I can appreciate this addition because it is a gameplay system that, if engaged with, which is a big if, it will encourage players to explore more and more depth of the game elsewhere, and that can lead to sort of a snowball effect where they start looking at rune words and how they can integrate those into armor sets, for example, and they're like, oh well, I want to add it to my sword, but I have to upgrade this, so I got to explore that. And then they go down these rabbit holes and start to explore other gameplay systems. I think that's great. Again, my frustration is just that I don't think that this is integrated in a way where enough players will have their curiosity piqued and they'll start to go down this rabbit hole. And even if their curiosity is piqued, there might not be that much compulsion when it comes to gameplay to push them into it. But when we talk about compulsion, without a doubt, Hearts of Stone excels with the narrative compulsion to continue the quest line and to see it through to the end. It is extremely well written, in my opinion. Dialogue is natural, characters' motivations are solid and rational, and there are some pretty clever twists and turns along the way. I also love the music. I love Gontro Dim's theme that plays whenever he's around, and you can even hear children dancing in the streets outside the cities and villages where he has a presence, and they're humming this tune or they're chanting it or singing a little song, and I love it. The idea that you can be like exploring a city and you might run into Gontro Dim and you hear somebody just walking, an NPC just walking, whistling that haunting tune. I find that so freaking cool, and I just love it. But once you wrap up Hearts of Stone, you are probably going to start tackling either the end of the base game or going straight into the Blood and Wine expansion. For me, I usually wrap up Hearts of Stone after finishing the main story, and then I go into the big expansion in Toussaint right after. Blood and Wine is extremely significant as an expansion to the game. Not only is it massive, it offers anywhere from 30 to maybe 50 hours of additional gameplay, depending on how much of it you sink your teeth into. And it also offers a totally different artistic style. NPCs and characters talk and act differently. The monsters are almost entirely original here. They, of course, add the Corvo Bianco estate, which is a vineyard that Geralt actually gets to own and eventually retire in. It also has upgrading of that vineyard so you can enhance it or even put your weapons on display, as I mentioned earlier. And based on how you complete certain quest lines, there's even additional characters that can end up at that villa with you. Like, for example, in the quest line Le Cage à Feu, which I probably horribly butchered the pronunciation of, you get to go and confront the Wight. This is the monster that lives in the abandoned mansion that has spoons hung all over the place. You can confront the Wight and refuse to try and save it, and you just get into a little boss fight in a room full of spoons, and it's an original boss fight, and then it dies. Once you win the boss fight, you get what you need and you leave. Or you can try to save the Wight, and if you are successful in solving the riddle and breaking the curse, you actually end up with a new friend. Her name is Marlena, and she can actually start working for you at the villa as the cook, which is appropriate since she was not able to eat for many years after presumably being cursed by Gunter O'Dim himself. This is another cute little tie-in because Gunter O'Dim, of course, has all the stuff with the spoons. He cracks the spoon during the Hearts of Stone expansion to start the magical thing that causes the ship to crash at the beginning with Geralt as a prisoner. And the spoon symbolism is used repeatedly throughout The Witcher 3, which apparently is, as I said earlier, a nod to some folklore of the area, which is new to me, but there you go. But her obsession with spoons, again, is sort of an homage to that old saying of, you know, if you're going to dine with the devil, do so with a long spoon. That's at least what somebody explained it to me in the comment section of my original critique video on this game. But I just think it's done really, really well. And I love the idea that even after you defeat Gunter O'Dim and you go into the Blood and Wine expansion, you're still seeing people that Gunter affected or afflicted with curses. And I find it really, really cool. So little tidbit for you there. I think Gunter is the one that did this. I also wish I had recorded audio in my most recent run through of this area and this quest line, because I could have sworn that you can actually hear Gunter O'Dim's theme playing at certain parts of the property when you are at this villa covered in spoons. I happened to screw up my audio recording on the most recent playthrough I did, where I don't actually have any audio captured of this area. But if you played through this or are going to play through it recently, let me know in the comments if the theme actually does play or if my brain is just making that up. Having said that, I think one of my favorite additions, weirdly enough, to the game is the villa and the customization there. I don't know why, I just love the idea of Geralt after all of these adventures and traveling so much and kind of living just out and about with Roach, to settle down and have a villa after all that hard work and then to be able to upgrade it and make it your own. I just love that, and I love how they implement it too. You can speak to the Major Domo once you gain the estate from Her Highness, and then you can start renovating your estate bit by bit. At first, you have just a few options. You have the ability to order a grindstone, you can upgrade the house for 5,000 crowns, or you can go and add an armor repair table so you can get all the buffs when you start your gameplay session at the villa. After a little while, you unlock another set of enhancements, which are to add a new bed, weapon rack, armor stands. You can upgrade a guest room as well, which will be probably important in the near future. And you can rebuild Roach's stable and even enhance and build out your garden. And you're not just doing this for cosmetic purposes, though that would be cool enough, I think, for many people to engage with it just for poops and giggles, but you also get enhancements and bonuses when you rest on your property in your own bed. For example, once you upgrade your bedroom and your bed, you actually get an enhancement to your maximum vitality. It increases by 1,000 points, which is super cool. Once you build out your library, you get a 5% bonus experience that you gain after combat encounters. You can upgrade your alchemy laboratory to have additional charges on all your bombs and potions. And if you happen to treat Roach to an upgraded stable, her stamina is also increased by 100%, doubling it. All of these are great additions. I love it. And I wish Cyberpunk 2077 had more of this available to players. They of course experimented with it later in like expansions and DLC and later like the 2.0 update. But I love the idea of having like an apartment or a house or a villa or something like that, which can be your base of operations. And then there are significant reasons to go through the process of upgrading and enhancing that home settlement or base or whatever it is. I just personally really like that. I think it makes sense narratively. I think it is a great way to encourage players to continue earning currency in the late game. And again, it's another incentive to keep players playing even after the main story maybe ends. I know there's a lot of players who tend to just put the controller down once the credits roll, but something like this, which serves as a long-term end game goal, especially with some of the more expensive enhancements that are available, I think this is great. In terms of the actual expansion and the quest lines, I really appreciate how in-depth each of these characters are. And I think some of the characters like Sienna or even Detlef have a lot more depth and complexity to them than many of the antagonists in the base game, which is something I alluded to earlier. It's not that I think the writing in the base game is lackluster or bad. I think it's very, very good. I just think it's exceptional in the expansions. And whether you look at Gunter O'Dim or Olgierd von Everec, or you look over on the Toussaint side of things with Sienna, like I think in general, it's just taken up a notch. It's improved even more and makes me love it all the more. And one thing that Blood and Wine does significantly better than the Hearts of Stone expansion is it expands player agency. There's multiple routes that you can go throughout the big expansion's main storyline, and it can totally change how it plays out for you. For example, a lot of people's favorite part of the Blood and Wine expansion is the fairy tale land, where you go when you see all of these little nods to old fairy tales. You recognize maybe some that you don't, whether it's like the werewolf granny, or you see, you know, basically Jack and the Beanstalk, or you see Rapunzel up in her tower. not in the best of shape. It's really, really cool and very clever and really fun. But there is a way you can play through this expansion where you never see that. Like, you just don't. Instead of going with Sienna and trying to confront her and then ending up in that land, you can just go straight to Detlef and never see it at all. Like, you'll get through the entire quest line, everything ends horribly, it's a very sad and depressing ending, and then it's over. Like, there is a way to do that, and I find that pretty remarkable, because Hearts of Stone pretty much plays out exactly the same for most players. Of course, at the very end, you can choose how you handle Olgierd, but in comparison, the Blood and Wine expansion is much more of a narrative role-playing expansion than Hearts of Stone was, which was much more linear. There's also a lot of smaller things that you can or can't do that have significant impact. For example, the ribbon that Sienna needs. If you do not get that, she does not survive. Like, she does not live through the end of the expansion. You have to have that ribbon, and it's something that is very easy for players to ignore. It's one of those like little optional objectives in the Fairy Tale Land. Again, it's those little bitty things where if you screw up just a little bit, if you're not paying that much attention, everything can go bad. I greatly appreciate it. And again, it kind of encourages repeated playthroughs or attempts for players to go back through and try it again to see if there's another outcome. I think a lot of studios could take nods from these expansions because there's just so much that they do so well, and it just encourages you to keep playing and keep playing. And when you consider that Blood and Wine is like a $20 expansion when it's not on sale, the value is ridiculously high. In terms of gameplay, there's of course entirely overhauled systems with mutations that add more complexity to character builds. These are mainly intended to fix the problem with overabundance of skill points later on in the game, since many of these added mutations require multiple skill points to apply. I think they're solid, and this is again one of the additions where you can tell that CDPR realized that maybe things weren't that balanced in the later game. Once you start to go to all of these places of power and you start to accumulate all of these skill points, maybe you have too many, because if you go through the route of building your version of Geralt, like, you're going to get there, everything's maxed out, and then you're just going to have like 3, 4, 5, 6 skill points extra that you don't need unless you're buying skills that you don't really want to use. You swap them in and out just for fun. But having the mutations actually gives you a reason to spend those in a way that's not useless. So I think the mutations are a great addition, and they were sorely needed by the time you reach like level 40. Furthermore, there's tons of other stuff that they added to the expansion, whether it's new Gwent activities, horse races, or even something as simple as the brand new monsters and Witcher contracts that keep things more interesting. There also seem to be a lot more combat encounters featuring many NPCs. In the base game, you might fight like 4 or 5 or 6 like grunt level enemies at the same time. In the Blood and Wine expansion, I think there are at least 4 different occasions where you will fight more than 10 enemies on screen at a time, even with the help of other NPCs or companions. And I don't know if that's just like a software enhancement or some sort of breakthrough they had with how they calculate enemy AI so they can have more NPCs on screen at a time. I don't know what it is, but it is a significant step up in encounter size compared to the base game, and I appreciate it. I think it's really cool, especially because if you're somebody that likes to play your Geralt very focused on the red route of skills, you can unlock the spinning sword maneuver, which can just plow through many enemies all at the same time. So it makes you appreciate big encounters like this with lots of people. But all told, I freaking love the Blood and Wine expansion. I think the only reason it's not my favorite of the 2 that came to The Witcher 3 is just because I love the story and I love the performances in the Hearts of Stone expansion just so much that it just takes it a little bit for me. But Blood and Wine is also phenomenal, and if that's your favorite expansion out of the 2, like, you are not wrong. Okay, they're both fantastic. And you know, a lot of people pointed to them back when they came out and said, see, this is how you should be doing expansions to your games. And in the last few years, like, it's only been proven more and more true, amazingly enough, most notably with the Shattered Space expansion for Starfield. I think a lot of people were expecting Bethesda to come out swinging, trying to convince people that Starfield was worth attention and worth playing even a year after launch, but it ended up being the most lackluster expansion of any game in recent memory. Like, painfully disappointing and lackluster. And even now, all these years later, I mean, we're 8 years after Blood and Wine and 9 years after Hearts of Stone. Even now, these expansions hold up. Like, if these launched as standalone games today, I think they'd be Game of the Year contenders. They're just that good. They're phenomenally well written. And going back through them like this year in anticipation of this video, it just makes me appreciate them so much more because one of the plagues on the modern industry, in my opinion, is god-awful writing. And I don't know if it's because they started hiring like activist writers who aren't really very good writers, because if they were, they would just be writers. They wouldn't be activist writers. The only reason they have to put activist on their name is to justify why they're bad at writing. And a lot of these companies have hired a lot of those people and they just are bad at their jobs, which is how you end up with god-awful writing in games like Forspoken or games like Saints Row Reboot, where apparently like the writers were genuinely shocked. People thought it was bad. People were shocked that it was so lackluster and the reception was so poor. They really thought they were onto something with the like Slay Queen kind of writing. And The Witcher 3 is not that at all. And I appreciate it so much for that. Like, I appreciated it back in 2016. I appreciate it so much more now. Because we've seen what happens when you have the opposite, and it's just a breath of fresh air. It's like a fine Sangreal from Toussaint, 1269 vintage, I think is the one in the quest line. I think that's the one you have to look for in the casks, but that's a deep cut. And you know, part of the intention of this video is not just to go through the expansions and the game again, but to also look at it through the modern lens, look at it from the perspective of somebody going on a decade after the fact and see if it really is that good or if we just didn't know any better. Because that is the case with some games where you go back and you're like, this was game of the year. It's like when you look back at Dragon Age Inquisition from 2014 and you're like, this one game of the year? Was it like a really bad year? Like what happened? I know some people love it, but like, damn. It's just surprising that would win game of the year with some of its shortcomings and some of its problems. But with The Witcher 3, the further away from it we get, the more I appreciate it. I think it's aging like a fine wine. It just gets even more remarkable the farther and farther away we get from it. And weirdly enough, Cyberpunk is also kind of like that. Granted, it didn't start very good, so it had nowhere to go but up. But I do think that is a strength of CDPR, at least so far, has been to like their ability to create and craft experiences that stand the test of time. And that is not easy to do. There's lots of games that are not what you might remember them to be. And The Witcher 3, thankfully, is one of those games that just, in my opinion, gets better and better as time goes by. But all of this leads me to our final big chapter of the video, which is to discuss The Witcher 4 and what I hope to see in the coming sequel. Like what I hope they take from Cyberpunk, what lessons I hope they take from The Witcher 3, what things I hope they shed and cut. And I'm going to go through it and we'll wrap this video up with a nice little bow, hopefully. So let's get into it. But first, a spin transition. Yay! Okay, we're back. Let's wrap this up. So at this point, I'm sure we've all seen the trailer for The Witcher 4. I think there is a lot to discuss in that trailer, and a lot of it other people have discussed far more intelligently than I ever could. But to offer my quick thoughts, I think it does a really good job of setting the tone and vibe for what they're going for in the new saga. Which, yes, is what they have referred to it as, which implies, at least indirectly, that this new game, The Witcher 4, is going to kickstart a new, probably trilogy of games with Ciri at the forefront. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think at the end of The Witcher 3, depending on which ending, of course, you got, but what almost certainly is the canonical ending where Ciri and Geralt go off to Witcher together, I think that sets this up very, very well, and I'm not bothered by it at all. I think Ciri makes a lot of sense for the next protagonist. I think a lot of us were also expecting maybe they would try to do a make your own Witcher sort of thing, like a lot of other RPGs. And while I do think that would have been cool, I also think this has plenty of potential for them to carefully write stuff specifically for Ciri, for them to have much higher stakes in the story, of course, given Ciri's elder blood and her background. In other words, I think there are perks and benefits to doing it either which way. If they went with Ciri as the protagonist, there's plenty of great stuff that can come from that. There's also some downsides, like not getting to make your own Witcher. But on the flip side, if they went create your own character, there would be pluses of making your own character, and then also negatives like the fact that you can't really super fine tune the story specifically for the protagonist protagonist, because they never know really what the protagonist is going to be. They have to keep it kind of generic in all the dialogue, all the questing and stuff like that. So I do think each option would have been good. I'm not bothered by this. And the other thing to remember is that in all of the other cinematic sizzle trailers that they put out for The Witcher 3, they set the tone. They are not about accurately depicting exactly what the character model will look like or what combat abilities will or won't be included in the final combat system. It's about setting the tone and letting you understand what vibe this game is going to present. And in that pursuit, I think it does a tremendous job. I personally was really worried that they would go Witcher 4 and they would lose the grit, because in the modern era, a lot of really amazing studios that previously specialized in really intense, gritty stories have kind of lost sight of that and have gone really cartoony and silly and stupid and cringy with a lot of their stuff. So seeing them retain that serious vibe, that serious tone, I'm excited for. I think that is encouraging. The other piece of this is kind of the elephant in the room as we head into this section of the video, which is the shift to Unreal Engine 5. In the beginning of the trailer, they show a little bit of text at the bottom of the screen that says that this trailer was pre-rendered with Unreal Engine 5 on an unannounced, unreleased, blah, 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 RTX NVIDIA super GPU. And there's a couple ways you can interpret that. It could mean that this is pre-rendered on hardware that doesn't really exist yet. So in the final version, this is what the game will look like when you're actually playing it on that hardware once it like exists. The other side of it, people are saying is, well, no, it just means that they pre-rendered it using this as the renderer. It still could have taken 10 minutes per frame, but they used that GPU for it. Either way, I don't think it says a whole lot, but it does say that the assets in the game look this good if this is the Unreal Engine 5 build of the game that they just turned all the dials up to make it look this good. And I think that that is really encouraging, because this trailer on a graphical level is stunning. They also have addressed one of my biggest frustrations from the base game, which is that there were like 5 different male NPCs that would just swap heads and hairstyles no matter where you were in the world. And that seems to be something that the MetaHuman tool set within Unreal Engine is specifically fixing. I don't know if they're using MetaHumans specifically or if they're going to be using some other solution for creating NPCs that are dynamic and varied, but it is encouraging that all of the NPCs look so different and also don't have that same vibe that a lot of games have, where all of the characters kind of look like siblings. That was one of those weird things that happens in Unreal Engine games, especially with like character creators. If you use an all-in-one tool set like that, where all of the characters kind of look like siblings, like everybody's player character from Hogwarts Legacy, for example, all looked related. They all look like brothers and sisters. It was really, really weird. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. So hopefully they've advanced that stuff to the point where they really do have extremely different faces and NPCs as you explore the world. I think that'd be really cool. It was never that jarring to see the same face again that you've seen 15 times before. You just kind of turn that part of your brain off because you're playing a video game and it's a video game. Don't think about it too hard. But if they could deal with that and have it much more varied in the fourth game, I'd be very okay with that. But the reason why Unreal Engine 5 being used for the game is such a big deal is because the Red engine that they used for The Witcher 3 and eventually Cyberpunk 2077 and the Phantom Liberty expansion was far from a slacker when it came to game engines. I mean, if you've played Cyberpunk 2.0 or if you've played the Phantom Liberty expansion or even just The Witcher 3, you know how capable this engine was. And they walked away from it to go into Unreal Engine all in. That's a big deal. I mean, it is not insignificant to abandon a tool set and a set of systems that you've used for years and years and years and just walk away from it to use something else. That to me says a couple things. For one, they've talked in interviews about the reasons for this. Number one, they said that it was just a matter of practicality. When you have a game engine like the Red engine, you're talking about needing dozens upon dozens of engineers to keep that engine running, to upgrade it, to add new technologies, to add new tools as you develop the game. It is like having a software development company and a game studio at the same time, and both teams need each other and have to be working in tandem constantly in order for the whole system to work. It's extremely complicated, extremely expensive, and as we've seen on some games, it doesn't always work out. Like for example, with something like Mass Effect Andromeda, where they're using EA's proprietary engine, but because the engineering team couldn't really get the systems that the game designers needed working, the whole game fell apart and was just a total disaster. And having the right tools is really, really crucial in fulfilling the vision of what you need to do. And sometimes it just doesn't really make sense to try and make this game with this tool set. I've heard a few developers talk about this, specifically when asked questions about Red Dead Redemption 2's graphical fidelity. The question basically just goes, why does Red Dead 2 look so freaking good after all of these years when a bunch of modern games struggle to look even half as decent? And the simple answer is, of course, that Rockstar is amazing and they do amazing work. But the other side of it too is that Red Dead Redemption 2 as a game is tailor-made for a console like the PlayStation 4 Pro. It doesn't have a lot of specular assets, meaning it's not dealing with big shiny glass panels. It's not dealing with complicated ray tracing needs like with neon lights within Night City. It doesn't have to deal with that. It's dealing with grass and dirt and rocks and trees. And those types of materials that are diffuse, like this desk mat, they don't reflect a ton of light. That is precisely what rasterized lighting is perfect for. You don't need complex ray tracing to make this look realistic or good and believable. What you do need it for is like reflective surfaces in the background or glass or shiny polished metal and things like that. That's what you really need ray tracing for. And that's why the Red Engine and all of those enhancements for ray tracing were so crucial for that game to look as good as it did after all of the updates, of course, with the overdrive ray tracing and stuff like that that Cyberpunk brought to the table. But when we look at The Witcher 4, this is not exactly Night City. Yeah, ray tracing would be great, and I'm sure will be included, but it's far from necessary to achieve really, really high fidelity. So a lot of the enhancements they specifically made to the Red Engine for Cyberpunk 2077 specifically are just frankly not that needed in The Witcher 4. So all of those perks and all of those strengths and advantages and proprietary systems and rendering pipelines, they're just not that crucial to pull off The Witcher 4. So then you start to look at other things. What does the Red Engine have that Unreal doesn't? And what does Unreal have that the Red Engine doesn't have? And this is, to be very clear, far above my pay grade, but it seems that in the simplest way possible, Unreal Engine for a lot of these big development studios works really well for developing big games quickly and also for finding talent that you can acquire and bring from other studios from all over the world. Whether it's fresh talent right out of universities who do a lot of their training in Unreal Engine because it's so ubiquitous at this point, but also because other studios, big studios, have talent that are familiar with the tool set. So you don't need to get hired at CDPR and spend 6 months learning how to use their engine. You can just jump right into Unreal Engine, which you've used at all of your other jobs. So it's just, oh, yep, what's the password to log in? Okay, now I'm ready to go. Let's work. You don't need to bother with any of that other stuff. And that is a real perk. That saves a ton of time and a ton of money, a ton of resources. And the other piece of this is, of course, that if they need proprietary systems developed, such as dynamic day-night cycles with NPC schedules, something that isn't built into Unreal Engine by default, they can develop that at CDPR, and I'm sure that they do work on it, but if they really need something elaborate put together, they can go to Epic Games and work hand in hand in tandem with their engineering teams. And because of how significant The Witcher 4 will be in gaming discourse, Epic Games will justify a lot of spend on engine enhancements for the sake of The Witcher 4. I've said it 1,000 times, I'm gonna keep saying it. The Witcher 4 is going to basically be the trophy game or a showcase game for not just Unreal Engine, but I think also for NVIDIA, just like Cyberpunk was the showcase game for ray tracing and all of that NVIDIA developed with overdrive ray tracing, path tracing, all of that. I think it's gonna be the same thing with The Witcher 4. I think we're gonna see a ton of trailers, a ton of tech demos, showcasing environments and different things that have been built for The Witcher 4, and that's part of the selling point for Unreal Engine. Because if Epic can go and say, look, CDPR is doing this with our engine. all of you other developers should join us and use our engine too. That's good business for them. It justifies the investment, and it makes The Witcher 4 even better because they can spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on engine enhancements that previously CDPR would have to front the bill for, but now Epic can at least subsidize the cost or maybe cover it entirely. So all of this to say, I've heard a lot of people stressed over the move to Unreal Engine and the fears that it will introduce things like shader compilation stutters or other such difficulties with frame timings once you're in open worlds, which is historically a problem within Unreal Engine games. But on the whole, I'm not too worried about it. I think they are well aware of those problems, and they've got a few years most likely before we see The Witcher 4 to figure it out. And I'm confident they really want to avoid another Cyberpunk situation. So I would be shocked if there are performance issues once again. But we'll keep an eye on it. And when they eventually do previews or reviews or whatever, absolutely you should wait till you see those before giving them your money. That goes without saying, hopefully. But if we talk about specific things that I'd like to see in The Witcher 4 after our long conversation about The Witcher 3 and its expansions, I have a list of things that I would like to see, recapping some of what we've discussed already and going into more specifics on some others. As I said earlier, one of my biggest frustrations with The Witcher 3 is with the movement. I think Geralt moves both too fast and then at other times too slow. I think his controls are really, really clunky and it's really easy to bump into things in different environments. I just think it's really, really frustrating because the rest of the game is so good. Geralt's movement drives me crazy, even all these years later. I personally prefer the movement of something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where the movements are really, really heavy and intentional. Arthur's not able to sprint anywhere near as long or as fast as Geralt, certainly, but I feel that he is much easier to control, especially in interiors. And one of the other pieces of this that makes Arthur and Red Dead so good in terms of movement, also with other games like The Last of Us Part 2, which has amazing movement controls and animations. It's something called animation blending or sometimes motion matching. There's a few different like colloquial terms for it, but it's basically being able to take multiple animations for a character, such as sprinting at full speed, sprinting at 75% speed, jogging, and then doing a nice little trot, and then walking briskly. Each of those should technically have its own animation because people walk differently based on how fast they're moving. I mean, if you've ever been on a treadmill, you know exactly what this is like. You know, once you break that like 3.5 to 4 miles per hour meter, like then you kind of do this weird jog because you're not really in your stride. But once you get going fast, then you go into this big full movement. And that's something which, as far as I can tell, the Red Engine has just never been that great at because they didn't really need to. In The Witcher 3, that was before this motion matching animation blending tech was really a thing. And by the time we got Cyberpunk 2077, we were talking about a first-person game. You didn't really need super nice animations for blending player movements because you couldn't see it, like you were in first person. So you don't need motion matching or animation blending or anything. And so it's something they never really had to develop for, but it's something that Unreal Engine actually supports now. And this right here is a little showcase that they did showing all of these new technologies that they had actually in Unreal Engine 5.4. So this is technically even older than the modern current version of Unreal Engine. It's been established and in the engine for a while now. But as you can see here, this is a keynote where they talked at Unreal Fest 2024 about this motion matching system. And again, this previously was something that was only really used by the biggest devs in the industry. It was a big deal that like Naughty Dog had a system for this. Rockstar, of course, had a system for this. But now Epic has it in Unreal Engine. And so basically they can go through and they can have a collection of a bunch of different animations and then blend them all together. And as you can see here, there's all sorts of individual little animations. And then based on character inputs, they can blend all of them together so players can move and react more realistically. And so just this is going to be something that will significantly improve the feel of controlling a character in something like The Witcher 4 compared to the movement system in The Witcher 3. So just something like that is going to make it feel next generation. And you can see with some examples they show of like vaulting over objects, that's actually something that's relatively easy to introduce in terms of controls in Unreal Engine. It's pretty easy to just enable that in the animation set. So that brings up another question, which is paired with movement, which is, are we going to finally get some light parkour or climb ability within The Witcher 4 compared to what we had in The Witcher 3? Of course, in The Witcher 3, we had vaulting. You could jump, you could try to leap over larger distances, you could climb up ledges, but it was all very, very stiff and had to be very specifically set up by the devs. I think there's a really good chance we get much more dynamic gameplay options available to us. I don't know if they'll give us stuff like climbing trees. That's not exactly necessary for a game like The Witcher, but I do think we'll get the ability to climb and jump and maybe even do a little bit of parkour while we're at it. And I hope they significantly improve the controls for horses as well, because Roach, it feels like, is more of a battering ram for trees than just a means of exploration and traversal. In terms of combat, I'm sure this is something they are working very, very hard at, and I don't have a lot of specific things that I'm looking for other than just more variety in the character builds, and hopefully more gear-based customization that isn't reliant on just finding the newest piece of armor, but rather things that encourage more crafting and upgrades of materials or items that you found while out exploring. I, for one, much prefer action RPGs or RPGs in general, where I find a really cool weapon and then I get to keep it and improve it as time goes by. I still remember playing Fallout New Vegas for like the first time and getting an anti-material rifle, and that became my baby. I cherished that weapon so much, and I worked hard to get it, but once I had it, it was very special to me. And one of the things about The Witcher 3 that frustrates me, as I've said a few times already in this video, is that you can get a really cool sword from Olgierd, or you can get a really cool piece of armor or something, but inevitably, within just an hour or two, you're going to find something that's just way better and is just worth dumping the old stuff. Even though you can do things to improve the old stuff, the game moves pretty quickly and you're going to just need to dump it eventually. Like, I understand some people love that. Some people love the feeling of like, ooh, new piece of candy, and then they drop the old one. I get it. Just personally for me, I like having that thing I found, I worked really hard to get, and then I cherish it and take care of it and improve it from there. That's just my thing, and I think it fits the vibe of The Witcher a little bit better than just all of this garbage being out in the world that you're just constantly swapping out pieces for. But again, that's just me. I understand I'm probably in the minority there, but that's just my preference. One specific thing I do hope to see with enemies and with combat in general is overhauls to the enemy AI. I'd like to see more variety in their tactics and approaches. I'd like them to be able to utilize strategies where they work together. A great example of this is in The Last of Us Part 2, where the Seraphites will actually whistle commands to each other. So if one person is killed, they can actually whistle to other NPCs on the map, communicating without the player knowing exactly what they are communicating. It's super, super cool, and I hope we see stuff like that implemented, not just in The Witcher 4, but also in other games. Whether you're going through a barbarian's camp or if you're hunting some monster, I hope they're able to work together a little bit better than they are in The Witcher 3, where they basically just all do their own thing, and if they happen to work together, cool, but most of the time they do their own thing. In that same vein, with improved enemy AI, I would like to see this also enhance stealth options. I think it makes a lot of sense that sometimes Ciri would not go into situations sword drawn ready to chop heads. I think it makes more sense if stealth were an option occasionally as well. I understand that The Witcher 4 is probably not going to be a stealth game, but I still do like the ability to sneak around objects or sneak into camps without needing to kill everybody just to get a single piece of loot or to find some quest objective. You know, this brings up the age-old problem of something called ludonarrative dissonance, and it's basically just a really fancy term for what happens in a video game where a character is supposed to be good, but they are killing hundreds or thousands of people while feeling nothing. Like, you know, in some games, maybe it makes sense, like Joel in The Last of Us Part 1, where he is the good guy, but he's also killing a lot of people, and that's something he's aware of, and it's discussed in the game that he's having to kill a lot of people even though he doesn't really want to. It's just what you have to do to survive. And, you know, he says a couple times stuff to the effect of like, I'm not that good of a person, you know. He doesn't want to talk about what he and Tommy had to do to survive in the 20 years between Sarah's death and the start of The Last of Us Part 1. So in those cases, it can make sense. But on the flip side, you have other games, like a lot of people will bring up the example of Uncharted, another Naughty Dog game, where Nathan Drake is a mass murdering serial killer. I mean, he is outside of his mind, and yet he's supposed to be like the good guy who's quirky and kind of funny. When you look at what he does, like he'll just be exploring outside this place he broke into to steal an archaeological artifact, and he's just popping people in the head left and right who have families to go home to, presumably. But then you're supposed to be like, he's so funny. He's so charming. Like, it doesn't really make sense. So you have to kind of turn your brain off to it. And one of the ways people get around this is like, oh, it only applies in cutscenes. That's only like, that's what's canon. Everything in gameplay is just gameplay. It's not really applicable. However you get around it is fine. But in the case of The Witcher 4 specifically, I do find it frustrating to have Geralt just like storming into situations he probably could get around peacefully, and he just murders everybody. He murders every bandit. He murders every enemy soldier that he could have left alone just to get into the chest that has maybe some loot he needs. I get it. It's a video game, but I do think that is something that should be maybe an option for players if they want to get more immersed and not do that type of thing, and maybe just stealth in those situations or take a peaceful route. I hope there are options there for them. Wasn't really possible in The Witcher 3. It was certainly more possible in Cyberpunk and the Phantom Liberty expansion, where they definitely did improve enemy AI and built out those different play styles. So I hope that's something we also see come to The Witcher 4 as well. I know they're capable of it. I just hope it's something that they work on. Another core gameplay thing I hope that they overhaul in The Witcher 4 is the excessive amount of loot. Again, I've talked about this earlier in the video, and I think that they are aware of the problem this presents, basically that you're playing as a Witcher, not as a garbage collector or a thrift store operator. So it doesn't really make sense for Geralt to just have buckets, or in this case, Ciri, buckets or backpacks full of garbage that she collected out in the world. I understand maybe you could say, oh, well, to a certain extent, Witchers will collect stuff and then sell it and flip it or whatever, but I just don't think it fits the vibe of like being a Witcher. You should be witchering. You should be killing monsters, collecting spoons and silver plates and rings and stuff. In certain situations, yeah, grab it and go. But when that's your primary means of income or whatever, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But again, that's just a pet peeve of mine. I do think they addressed this in the overhaul 2.0 update for Cyberpunk 2077, where they did change a lot of how the loot works. Basically, in that 2.0 update for Phantom Liberty and Cyberpunk in general, they changed a lot of how the loot system works, so you no longer have just a ocean of components to deal with, but rather you pick up high-level individual weapons or items that you can then disassemble or break down. It's a really simple change, but I think it makes more sense tonally and in the context of the gameplay loop. And that, at least to me, suggests that they were aware there was some problem. Like, players were just getting flooded with way too much garbage that they would eventually just give up on trying to manage it. And again, this is just maybe a pet peeve of mine. I just don't really like micromanaging all of the garbage I have in my bags or backpacks. I want to play as a Witcher. I want to play as a fixer, you know, in Cyberpunk. I want to play the game and play those really cool things. I don't want to just run around like, okay, I've got 15 of these individual pelts, and then I've got 35 of these teeth, and then I've got 22 pieces of rotten meat, and I've got, like, I just don't personally like that. I want to be a Witcher. Let me be a Witcher. I'll do that. If it's a pelt for a monster I worked really hard to kill, cool. But if it's just like, oh, squirrel hides, okay, like then I'm no more than a junk dealer, and I don't like that. It's busy work that I think slows down gameplay, and I would like it smoothed out personally. But speaking of loot, there's also other things that could be enhanced with NPCs in general that are giving you loot or buying it from you, not just with their own AI where they behave more realistically. I've said before, I love the way that Kingdom Come Deliverance as a franchise handles this stuff, with NPCs commenting on your clothes, the conditions of them. If you've been out and about and you're really dirty or muddy, or you've recently crouched through a field where horses were hanging out and defecating. People will comment on your smell and not serve you or charge you more. I love that kind of thing, those types of immersive gameplay systems where NPCs notice things about you based on how you've played the game. And I think stuff like that implemented into The Witcher 4 would be awesome. Just imagine if you had a really crazy fight against some really gross monster, and then you go back into town to sell off a bunch of stuff or to complete and fulfill the contract by showing them the head, and a bunch of NPCs start commenting on the smell and comment on how dirty you are and how gross you are. I think that could be super immersive and super cool. I think other things could also be introduced, such as dynamic weather systems, whether it's snowstorms, rainstorms, stuff like that. That could also influence player behaviors or NPC behaviors, whether that means everybody goes inside, something as simple as that, or if it means that after a hefty rainstorm, new quests pop up where maybe drowners have come up onto the shoreline because the shoreline has risen after a local flood as a result of the rainstorm or something like that. More dynamic interactions between these systems would be great, and I'm sure they're experimenting with all sorts of stuff like that. Somebody in chat the other day also said they hope that we have sort of a city-based or town-based reputation system, and I think that that's actually really, really cool. If you've played something like Fallout New Vegas, you know exactly what this is like. In that game, you know, there's places like Good Springs where you might have a great reputation with them and they treat you better and you're welcomed there with open arms. Or maybe down at Novak, you are hated and loathed, or Boulder City, or in an individual vault or something, or on the Strip. Each of those places are changed based on your actions and your behaviors and your reputations with the people that live there. And I actually do think this makes a lot of sense in a Witcher game, that a Witcher would come to a village, potentially solve their problems with a monster that's been, you know, plaguing them for a while. And then that reputation changes and they are maybe more likely to recommend you to nearby villages, or next time you come through, they'll pay you more because they like to see you and because they're more confident in your abilities. And then if they add in dynamic monster hunts or Witcher contracts, then that could be something where there's even more opportunities for players to engage with that town on a recurrent basis. You could build better relationships with local shopkeepers or blacksmiths and things as a result of that. I think this is great. I would love to see that. In The Witcher 3 right now, it's like you go, you fill out this contract and they're like, that was nice of you to not charge me as much, or screw you for charging me that much. And then you move on. And that's just kind of it. You just write on. And I understand thematically that maybe makes sense where Geralt does travel. They're very nomadic, where they just move from village to village, city to city. Wherever they're needed, they fulfill the contract and move on. So it's likely that they wouldn't see those people again. But I think, again, if we're talking about a video game, it does make sense when we're talking about role play specifically that player choices should influence how those people react to them and treat them moving forward. And it shouldn't just be treated as though those decisions happen in a vacuum. I think it's cool if they kind of echo and ripple out beyond just that individual quest giver or person that you're helping. I will say that there is a mod that actually adds in a reputation system to the game. As you can see, it has a new tier within the inventory, and your reputation is defined based on individual factions, basically. So Temeria might treat you differently than those within Skellige or Toussaint. And how they have this working in the mod is pretty simple, where basically your buying and selling prices will be affected based on that. So you can see within negotiations specifically, there is an effect based on your reputation that will make that negotiation easier or more difficult. It's a really simple idea. It seems to work really, really well. Yeah, as you can see, reputation increased as you complete more contracts with them or as you fight people within those areas. It's of course very, very simple and rudimentary because it is a mod. You know, this wasn't designed from the ground up for the game, but I do think something like this could be really, really cool if they implement it into the game more broadly, and it didn't just affect buying or selling purchase prices, but also even stuff like NPC behaviors or maybe what contracts you get offered to begin with. You know, in the context of the books, Witchers are not that needed anymore. Like, monsters are becoming much more scarce, and of course in The Witcher 3 they kind of fudged that a little bit for the sake of the gameplay. Like, you need monsters to fight, you're a Witcher, you kind of have to have that. So if they want wanted to follow in that vein, they could also do something where it's like, hey, monsters are pretty rare and maybe witchers are not that trusted or well known. So if Ciri wants work as a witcher, especially since Geralt is basically retired in Toussaint, as far as we understand it in The Witcher 4, I think that can make sense where there's a reputation system. As you get more well known and well liked and respected, word of mouth carries, and you start to unlock even more monster contracts and witchering contracts, and that gets you to the point where you can actually build up a pretty big and profitable venture with lots of options as your name carries through the land. I think that could be really cool. I know you could say like, oh, well, who wouldn't know who Ciri is after the end of The Witcher 3? And I get it. But I also get the vibe where in that trailer for The Witcher 4, the monster says like, you can't escape your fate, you can't change your fate or whatever. And they imply multiple times that Ciri is trying to escape who she is or her destiny or her fate or the fate of those around her or something. So I wouldn't be surprised if she goes by like a different name or if she's undercover trying to not let people know who she is or her background. That would not surprise me at all. So I think you could get away with it that way, where she's kind of starting fresh and from scratch. In terms of narrative stuff, I don't have a whole lot of specifics here either, other than I would like more companion opportunities to work with NPCs or other characters within the story for prolonged periods of time. I really like some of the quests and missions where Geralt got to go with Kira Metz or Yennefer or Triss or whoever, or even Ciri. And I really, really love those moments, and I would love the option to maybe bring them with me to complete witchering contracts or perhaps even like side quests and exploration. I know that's a bit of a long or tall ask, but I think it could be really, really cool. But frankly, after playing Phantom Liberty, I'm not that worried about their capabilities when it comes to writing or set pieces or anything like that. I think they know what they're doing. And there's other stuff we could go through, like the obvious stuff. Hey, I hope the game's bigger. I hope it's beautiful. I hope it's polished. I hope the open world is really immersive and exciting. And maybe there's more dynamic stuff where you're riding on the road and you encounter somebody like in Red Dead 2, where you just run into somebody, an escaped prisoner who asks for your help. Like all of that stuff goes without saying, probably, maybe not because I just had to say it, but hopefully you get what I mean. Like there's some stuff where just obviously we hope they crank the dials up and the game is bigger and better and more polished and refined. And I think to a certain extent, that's what's going to happen. The budget's going to be crazy for this game, and I think they will get there. But in the shadow of The Witcher 3, I think there are some specifics that we can hope for that I just ran through. And I am sure they have thought of almost all of that. I think a lot of this is just about cranking those dials, and it's going to be about the execution of those ideas. As I said, with some stuff like the mutation system in the Blood and Wine expansion, super cool. I think it's a little bit late when it's introduced. I think it could have been useful in the Hearts of Stone expansion, but better late than never. And other stuff like the rune rights, for example, within the Hearts of Stone expansion, great idea, but I think it's introduced really poorly. And I think a lot of players will just ignore it when they play through the game because they don't really need to. Enemy balancing and combat balancing and difficulty just in general, I think needs to be overhauled and streamlined so that it's more consistent. So players are encouraged to try every system and everything that they build out for the game. I think all of this stuff is things they're aware of, and a lot of these individual pieces, they either improved or enhanced in the expansions, or they tried to tackle them with Cyberpunk 2077 and the 2.0 update and Phantom Liberty. But here where we sit, all these years later after The Witcher 3, I am still just in awe of how solid everything feels, how well it all works together. And yes, when we try to critique it, we can find things to poke at and holes to poke. We can find that if we're starting to really try to break it apart and look for it. But do not get it twisted. The Witcher 3 is a masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It is a game that is standing the test of time incredibly well. The expansions also are standing the test of time incredibly well. And I think it deserves all of the credit and laudations that it has received over the last approaching decade. When I started working on this video after the Starfield saga, which was an 8-hour video breaking down the development process and everything wrong with Starfield, I was expecting to go back through The Witcher 3 and have a lot more problems with it, to disagree with a lot of things I said in 2017 and maybe just be like, actually, no, there's a lot of weaknesses here. And while some of the stuff I said back then, I still totally agree with, like movement and like frustrations with inventory, stuff like that. On the whole, where we're at right now in the industry, I appreciate it way, way more. Like in a lot of ways, it feels like a breath of fresh air, where even though there are some things to get frustrated by or some weaknesses here and there, so much of the game is just so fantastic and is so different from games today where the writing is awful, where there aren't really any risks taken, where it's just generic, boilerplate, boring garbage, where just nobody wants to have a dark storyline. Nobody wants to have anything bad happen in their story. Nobody wants to explore difficult topics in the game. They just want to sit around drinking coffee like in Dragon Age Veilguard. Meanwhile, you play The Witcher 3 and just the Bloody Baron quest line is one of the most intense, emotional, and haunting quest lines you'll probably ever play in a video game. And it just really highlights the difference between some of these studios and the difference between, in my view, like game development by corporate committee and game development by artists, by people trying to tell a compelling story and explore interesting topics. And I appreciate The Witcher 3 for what it is way more now compared to what I did just a handful of years ago. And I think that that's both surprising and unsurprising. I would have thought by this point, going on a decade after The Witcher 3, we would have gotten a lot of spiritual successors and a lot of other games that are kind of in the same vein that are really close to it. But the fact that so many studios have struggled to mimic what this game did really well, I think just shows how remarkable it truly is. But listen, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I could have also gone into in this video that I didn't get to or I overlooked. As always, if you have thoughts on The Witcher 3, things it did really well or really poorly that I didn't get into, at least not as much as you would have hoped, please leave those comments below. I'm sure other people would love to chime in as well. This was a fun little project going back through The Witcher 3 and reappreciating it for everything that it did so fantastically well. I'm really thankful to you guys for allowing me to justify this and watching this video so that I could do it and it makes sense for me and my team to work on it. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. As always, I mean, you guys are making my dreams come true every single day. You're helping me provide jobs to my editors. You're making the lives of my children and my wife way better. Like, you really are just amazing, and never ever think I take any of you for granted. This is an actual dream come true that I get to do this for a living. And I truly appreciate it. Whether you just like the videos or subscribe or you just watch them and move on with your day, thank you truly. I will say, if you want to go above and beyond, you can become a channel member either here on Luke Stevens, or you can go to Luke Stevens Live, the channel where I post live stream clips, where I stream all the time. Like, that's the channel you probably should be a member on, because it has a ton of extra perks and you get to be in chat and members only chat, and we do member only streams. I do an exclusive member only video once a month. So if you're a member, you just get a free video where I share with you my favorite Christmas games, or where I go and show you like a tour of the studio, or I have you help me design a combat encounter for the D&D campaign I run for my friends. All sorts of crazy stuff. So if you're interested in that, consider becoming a member over there. I'll have all of those links below in the description box in that link tree. So check that out if you are interested and if you are willing to support a little bit more and get a ton of cool perks. Okay, everyone, so I am actually in the Bahamas right now vacationing. It's very beautiful, like amazingly clear water. It's freakish. It's amazing. But I realized I did not record the thank you message for all the patrons who made this video possible. And so that's what I'm doing here now. I've got a long list of all of you guys who made this possible. And if you are interested in supporting moving forward for future videos, check out the YouTube membership tabs, all that stuff I talked about already. So let's do this. Forgive the wind. I can't really control that. So a big thank you to Joaquin Pedersen, Cameron Wright, Declan Robinson, Kush Shrivastava, Kino Mansky, Sean Campbell, Mark Austin Fleming, Tobias Villegrim, Mr. Blue Star, Sonia Tikkanen, Daniel Young, Gerardo Alonso, I Got Raw Toast, Offhanded 1999, Nick P, Hans Keating, Brandon Cortez, Odin Arrow 28, and Will B. Also thank you to Oren Cohen, Maddie, iRock Z11, Oliver Montemayor, and Daniel Carroll. So again, thank you all for making this possible. It is an actual dream come true to be able to talk about video games for a living, and then to also get to go on vacations like this It's absolutely bonkers to me, and I owe it all to you guys. So truly, truly, thank you, and I will stop talking over the wind, and I will let Luke back in the studio send us off. But thank you all again for watching and for making this possible. But with that said, guys, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thanks for chatting about The Witcher 3 with me. Thank you for all the comments, the support. You guys are amazing. Have a wonderful, wonderful start to your new year, and I'll see you in the next video. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.